My name is Bernice, and at 33, I learned the exact market value of my family's loyalty. At my stepdad's biggest investor dinner, the one I spent 8 months securing, he pointed a manicured finger at me and laughed. "Don't mind Bernice," he told the table of billionaires. "She's just the waitress tonight." My stepbrother Derek sat next to him, wearing a custom suit paid for by the credit line I negotiated, grinning like he had authored the $70 million buyout sitting in front of them. I was the only one standing, wearing a blazer I bought off the clearance rack, holding the empty tray I had used to distribute the financial portfolios. But here is what Richard and Derek did not know. The man sitting across from them did not build his empire by investing in the loudest voice in the room. And the question he asked next froze the blood in my stepdad's veins. Welcome back to Linda Vengeance, where invisible people finally stop fixing the broken machines and let the entitled ones deal with the wreckage. If a story like this resonates with you, you know the quiet rage of being erased. Drop a comment with your age and let me know where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. I need to pull you into that private dining room in Portland, Maine, so you understand exactly what was stolen from me. The room smelled like seared scallops and expensive cologne. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Casco Bay was a churning black void under the December sleet. Inside, the heat was stifling. I'm a financial strategist. I build the hidden architecture that keeps failing companies alive. For 12 years, I navigated union disputes, supply chain bottlenecks, and crippling debt for Sterling Logistics. Nobody handed me an office. Nobody offered me equity. When I asked Richard for a title change 3 years ago, he patted my shoulder and told me to be a team player. That was the dynamic. Richard played golf and shook hands. Derek bought sports cars and expensed his lunches. I sat in a windowless cubicle, staring at pivot tables until my vision blurred, keeping the creditors from seizing the trucks. The dinner that night was the finish line. Marcus Thorne was a maritime logistics titan from New York. He had the capital to absorb Sterling Logistics and clear our debts. I wrote every word of the buyout proposal. I spent nights awake verifying the compliance codes and building the risk mitigation models. When I walked into the alcove to hand out the thick, foil-stamped leather binders, my hands smelled like printer ink. I set a copy in front of Thorne. I set one in front of Richard. I set the last one in front of Derek. Richard leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He flashed his country club smile. "Derek here is the future of this company," Richard announced, gesturing to his son. "The visionary behind this new direction. And don't mind Bernice. She's just the waitress tonight." A polite ripple of laughter circled the table. Derek adjusted his silk tie and puffed out his chest. I stepped back into the shadows near the coat check. I crossed my arms. The fabric of my blazer scratched against my wrists. I watched the men who had spent a decade taking credit for my brain laugh at my expense. But Marcus Thorne did not smile. He opened the leather binder. His eyes darted across the executive summary, absorbing the dense algorithms and tax loophole architecture with predatory speed. He did not look at Richard. He looked dead into Derek's eyes. "Walk me through the Q3 EBITDA margins," Derek Thorne said, his voice flat and quiet, "and explain the specific tariff offset mechanisms utilized in Chapter 4. The dining room went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Derek opened his mouth. A hollow puff of air came out. He looked at his father. He looked down at the closed binder in front of him. A single bead of sweat formed at his temple and slid down his jaw. Against the mahogany table, Derek's phone began to vibrate. It buzzed in short, rapid bursts. 2-factor authentication alerts. I recognized the rhythm because I had set them up. Derek ignored the phone, gripping his napkin so tight his knuckles turned white. Thorne snapped the folder shut. The sound cracked through the room like a physical blow. "That is what I thought," Thorne said. He rested his hands flat on the leather cover. "You think I wire $70 million based on a glossy binding and a legacy surname." Richard sat forward, the ice rattling in his glass. "Now, Marcus Derek is a big-picture executive. He handles the logistics and the broad strokes. My diligence team pulled the metadata on these projections, Thorne interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. They tracked the IP addresses of the server uploads. They analyzed the timestamp edits and the coding logic behind your routing software. Thorne stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket. He did not look at Derek or Richard. He pointed a single, unyielding finger past the table, right into the shadows where I stood. The intelligence in this proposal did not come from a golf course, Thorne said. It came from her. Richard's jaw tightened. He turned his head slowly to look at me. The affable facade peeled away, leaving only raw venom. I am not signing a single document until she speaks, Thorne stated. You have exactly 48 hours. Present the real leadership team by Wednesday evening, or this deal dies and Sterling Logistics sinks to the bottom of the Atlantic. Thorne walked out of the room. His assistants followed like silent ghosts. The heavy oak door clicked shut. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Richard gripped his water glass so hard I thought the crystal would shatter in his bare hand. The 48-hour clock had just started, and the relentless buzzing of Derek's phone told me the war had already begun. The drive back to my apartment took 12 minutes. I drove with the heater off and the windows rolled down 2 inches. I needed the bitter Atlantic air. I needed the bite of the Maine winter to cut through the adrenaline flooding my system. Snowplows had pushed thick banks of gray slush against the curbs along Commercial Street. The streetlights cast a sick yellow glow over the icy asphalt. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached, but my mind raced with terrifying clarity. 48 hours. Marcus Thorne had given us exactly 2 days. 2 days for Richard to present a real leadership team or lose the $70 million lifeline. I knew Richard. I knew his pride. He would rather watch Sterling Logistics burn to the ground than admit his stepdaughter held the matches. I parked my sedan in the uncovered lot behind my apartment building. The heater block cord crunched under my boots as I walked toward the stairwell. I lived in a third-floor walk-up. No elevator, no covered parking. The rent was cheap because the radiators hissed and the floorboards warped in the summer humidity. I brought home a respectable salary on paper, but I rarely kept it. Whenever the company missed a payroll cycle, I quietly deferred my own paycheck. Whenever the union threatened a walkout over delayed benefits, I wired cash from my personal savings to bridge the gap. My therapist called it functional over-responsibility. It is a sterile, clinical term for a very messy human flaw. It means you believe your only value is your utility. It means you think you can purchase love and safety by fixing everyone else's disasters. For 12 years, I had operated under the delusion that if I just worked hard enough, if I just saved Richard from one bankruptcy, he would finally look at me and see a daughter. Tonight, Marcus Thorne shattered that delusion. I was not a daughter. I was a waitress. I unlocked my door and stepped into the dark apartment. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights. The glow of the street lamp outside filtered through the blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the living room. I dropped my keys on the counter. I opened my laptop. I am not a hacker. I'm an accountant with an exceptional grasp of digital architecture. When Richard refused to pay for a dedicated IT department 5 years ago, I built the company's back-end servers myself. I wrote the routing algorithms. I structured the firewall. I held the master administrative keys. I booted up the system and logged into the remote server. I wanted to check the daily port logs to see how many shipments were stalled. But the moment the dashboard materialized on my screen, a red warning flag flared in the upper right corner. Active user, high-level access. It was midnight on a Tuesday. The warehouse managers were asleep. The dock workers were off shift. I pulled up the Active Directory and stared at the user ID. Derek Sterling. Derek did not log into the back end at midnight. Derek barely knew how to operate the payroll portal. My stomach tightened. The cold air from the drive had vanished, replaced by a sudden, suffocating heat. I clicked into the live monitoring module. A string of command lines unspooled across my screen in real time. He was not just browsing. He was in the secure financial directories. I leaned closer to the monitor. The blue light washed over my face. My breath caught in my throat. Derek was executing a bulk download of the proprietary routing software I had coded. But he was not stopping there. He was moving into the legacy accounting ledgers, the folders containing the raw, unedited financial histories before I restructured them for the Thorne presentation. I watched his cursor dart across the interface. He was opening the file properties. He was changing the metadata. The author tags on the original routing patents read Bernice Anderson. Derek was attempting to overwrite the registry keys. He wanted the digital footprint to show his name. He was trying to steal the intellectual property Thorne had demanded. But then he made a lateral move that sent a spike of pure ice straight into my heart. He opened the operational expense accounts. These were the highly restricted ledgers where I juggled the incoming cash flow to pay off our most demanding vendors. Derek initiated a transfer sequence. He was moving phantom funds across blind accounts, creating a digital paper trail of unauthorized wire transfers. And he was linking that specific paper trail directly to my administrative login credentials. He was not just stealing my work, he was building a snare. If Thorne walked away from the deal, Sterling Logistics would default within a week. The federal regulators would descend. Auditors would tear the company apart, looking for the missing millions Richard had squandered. Richard and Derek needed a scapegoat. They needed a sacrificial lamb to throw to the federal prosecutors. They were framing me for corporate embezzlement. The stakes instantly shifted. This was no longer about a fragile ego or professional disrespect. This was survival. Embezzlement at this scale carried a severe federal prison sentence. Richard had smiled at me at the dinner table, knowing his son was likely planning to lock me in a cage to save their own skin. I watched Derek's clumsy digital maneuvers. He was using a rudimentary script to alter the timestamps. He was sloppy. A seasoned forensic accountant would spot the anomalies in an hour. But Richard did not need the frame-up to be flawless. He only needed it to be convincing enough to satisfy an initial indictment. He only needed me to take the fall. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. My first instinct was to terminate his session. I could lock his IP address out of the server with 3 keystrokes. I could call him and demand he stop. The obedient stepdaughter, the one who always de-escalated the family crises, screamed at me to fix it quietly. But the obedient stepdaughter died the moment Richard called her a waitress. I pulled my hands back from the keys. I let him work. If I blocked him now, he would claim it was a system error. He would find another way. I needed him to commit to the crime. I needed the digital equivalent of a smoking gun. Instead of fighting his intrusion, I opened a shadow terminal. I wrote a silent command script. I did not block his downloads or his metadata alterations. I built a transparent digital perimeter around his session. Every click, every altered timestamp, every forged transfer request was captured, encrypted, and routed to a secure external hard drive sitting on my kitchen counter. I was letting him dig his own grave while I meticulously measured the depth. He thought he was altering the master ledger. He did not know I had migrated the actual master files to a partitioned server 3 months ago. He was tampering with a ghost system, a highly convincing decoy. I watched his cursor move for another 40 minutes. I memorized his digital cadence. I studied his desperation. He was terrified. Thorne had spooked him to his core, and this sloppy frame job was the panic response of a cornered animal. When Derek finally logged off at 1 a.m, the silence of my apartment returned. The hissing of the radiator sounded like a coiled snake. I sat back in my chair. The encrypted drive blinked with a steady green light. I held the absolute proof of his attempted fraud. The federal prison sentence he tried to build for me was now waiting for him. I closed the laptop, but I did not go to sleep. The 48-hour window was closing. The Thorne deal was a burning fuse, and Richard was holding the dynamite. I needed to map out the next sequence. I needed to calculate exactly how to dismantle a logistics empire without breaking a single law myself. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the faucet. I splashed freezing tap water on my face. The shock grounded me. I looked at my reflection in the small mirror above the sink. The bags under my eyes were heavy. My skin looked pale. I had given my youth to a family that viewed me as a disposable asset. Tomorrow, Richard would expect me in the office at 6 in the morning. He would expect me to brew the coffee, organize the crisis response, and fix the Thorne situation while Derek played the victim. They would smile at me. They would offer false apologies. They would try to keep me docile while they tightened the noose around my neck. The digital trap was set. The back-end server was armed. But software alone would not protect me from the emotional warfare Richard and his wife were about to unleash. As I reached for a towel, my phone vibrated on the counter. The screen illuminated the dark kitchen. A text message banner flashed across the glass. It was not from Richard. It was not from Derek. The message was from my mother. Patricia Sterling never texted me after midnight, unless the sky was falling. I stared at her name glowing in the dark. The text preview showed only a few words, but the demanding tone bled through the screen. She was not asking for a favor. She was issuing a summons. And I knew, with perfect, sickening clarity, that the war was about to arrive right at my front door. The knock came at 6 in the morning. It was not a hesitant tap. It was 3 sharp, rapid strikes against the cheap wood of my apartment door, echoing through the quiet hallway. I was already awake. I had not slept. The encrypted drive containing Derek's digital sabotage sat on my kitchen island, a silent witness to the treason brewing within my own family. I pulled my worn cardigan tighter around my shoulders and walked to the entryway. I did not need to check the peephole. The text message from midnight had been a warning shot. This was the invasion. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. My mother stood on the threshold. Patricia wore a camel hair cashmere coat that cost more than 2 months of my rent. Her blonde hair was sprayed into an immovable helmet of perfection. The freezing Maine wind had flushed her cheeks, but her posture was rigid, demanding immediate entry. She did not say good morning. She pushed past me into the narrow foyer, bringing the sharp scent of expensive floral perfume and winter frost into my stale apartment. "You need better locks," Patricia said, slipping off her leather gloves. "Anyone could just walk right in here." I closed the door. "You did," I replied. She ignored the response, stepping out of her designer boots and walking directly toward my kitchen. Patricia operated under the assumption that any space belonging to me was merely an extension of her own territory. I followed her, watching her run a critical finger over the edge of my laminate countertops. "I am brewing coffee," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Thank God," she sighed, sinking onto one of the metal bar stools. "It was a disaster last night, Bernice, a total nightmare. Your stepfather did not sleep a wink. He was pacing the hardwood floors until 4 in the morning. His blood pressure must be through the roof." I stood by the coffee maker, listening to the dark roast drip into the glass carafe. She was waiting for me to ask how Richard was doing. She was waiting for me to step into my designated role as the family caretaker. I said nothing. I reached into the cabinet and pulled out my favorite mug. It was a heavy, handcrafted ceramic cup I had purchased from a local artisan during a rare weekend trip to the coast. It was one of the few items in the apartment that held genuine personal value to me. Patricia reached across the counter and took the mug from my hand before I could pour. "Fill this one for me," she instructed. "I need the caffeine. I have to call the caterers for the country club winter gala by noon, and I cannot sound frantic." I poured the coffee into her stolen cup. I watched her bring it to her lips. She took a long sip. When she lowered the ceramic, a stark, dark red crescent of her signature lipstick remained smeared across the rim. It was a striking visual, a bright stain on something clean. My mother had spent her entire life consuming my resources, my time and my intellect, always leaving her mark, always taking without ever asking for permission. Richard has a unique sense of humor. Patricia continued, waving a manicured hand in the air. "You know how he gets at these high-stakes dinners. Calling you a waitress was just his way of breaking the ice with Marcus Thorne. It was a joke, Bernice. You cannot take these things to heart." "A joke," I repeated. The word tasted like ash. Yes, she insisted, leaning forward. But Marcus Thorne is a humorless man. He overreacted. And now we have a situation. Richard needs to present the leadership team to Thorne by tomorrow evening. Derek is going to lead the pitch. But Derek is a big picture thinker. He does not know the granular details of the routing algorithms or the tax offsets. Patricia took another sip from my mug. The red stain grew wider. "We need you to write a script," she said. Her tone shifted from conversational to a direct command. "A bulletproof script for Derek. You need to break down the EBITDA margins and the union negotiation frameworks into simple bullet points." Derek has a photographic memory for speeches. If you write it out, he can perform it perfectly. Thorne will sign the papers, and this whole ugly misunderstanding will go away. I stared at the lipstick mark. She was asking me to hand over the keys to my own intellect so the man who humiliated me could cash a $70 million check. She was demanding I arm the very stepbrother who just 5 hours ago was actively altering server metadata to frame me for a federal crime. I crossed my arms. "Why are you here, Mom? Richard usually sends his assistants to deliver his orders." Patricia stiffened. Her eyes darted away from mine, fixing on the dripping coffee machine. "Because Richard is furious with you. He thinks you stood there looking sullen on purpose to sabotage the dinner. I volunteered to come here to talk some sense into you. We put a roof over your head, Bernice. We paid for your undergraduate degree. You owe this family your loyalty." "I bought that roof with 12 years of unpaid overtime," I stated, keeping my breathing even. "I managed the logistics network while Richard played golf. I kept the creditors away from your front door. I do not owe you a script." Patricia slammed the ceramic mug down on the counter. Coffee sloshed over the rim, pooling on the laminate. "You do not understand the stakes," she hissed, her voice cracking. Her pristine facade fractured, revealing a raw, terrifying desperation underneath. "You think this is just about Richard losing his CEO title? You think this is just about corporate pride?" She stood up, leaning over the kitchen island, her face inches from mine. 10 years ago, the company needed a capital injection to upgrade the shipping fleet. Patricia whispered, her hands trembling. The banks would not approve the commercial loan on Richard's signature alone. The debt-to-income ratio was too high. He needed a guarantor. He needed collateral. The silence in the kitchen grew heavy. A cold realization washed over me. "You co-signed the primary notes," I said. I signed everything she shot, back tears pooling in the corners of her eyes. The mezzanine debt, the revolving credit lines. I leveraged our residential estate. I leveraged my personal investment accounts. I signed my name on the dotted line because Richard promised me the logistics boom would cover the interest. If Marcus Thorne walks away, I continued tracing the logical path of the financial ruin Sterling Logistics defaults. The bank does not just take Richard's company. They execute the personal guarantees. "They take my house," Patricia sobbed, her voice losing all its aristocratic polish. "They take the cars. They freeze my accounts. I will be bankrupt. I will be ruined in this town. My friends at the club will turn their backs on me. I will have nothing." I looked at my mother. I saw a woman who had sold her own financial security to feed her husband's ego. She had tethered herself to a sinking ship. And now, as the water rushed over the deck, she was demanding I throw myself into the freezing ocean so she could use my body as a raft. The trauma response inside my chest flared. The old instinct, the desperate child who just wanted her mother to feel safe, screamed at me to open my laptop. It screamed at me to write the script, to fix the disaster, to endure the disrespect just one more time, to save her from the humiliation of poverty. But then I looked at the encrypted drive holding Derek's server logs. I remembered the smirk on Richard's face. I looked at the dark red lipstick staining my favorite mug. I took a slow, deep breath. The icy air of the apartment filled my lungs. No. The single syllable hung in the air between us. Patricia blinked. The tears stopped. Her expression morphed from desperate sorrow to genuine shock. "What did you say?" I said, "No." I repeated, my voice steady, devoid of any warmth. I will not write the script. I will not save Derek. I will not fix Richard's mistakes. The debt you signed for belongs to you. You cannot do this, Patricia screamed, stepping back as if I had struck her. You are my daughter. You are supposed to help us. If we lose everything, it is your fault. I walked around the kitchen island. I picked up her leather gloves and held them out to her. The door is behind you, I said. Patricia snatched the gloves from my hand. Her chest heaved. The polished, elegant matriarch was gone, replaced by a cornered, vicious stranger. You are a selfish, ungrateful girl, she spat, her words laced with pure venom. Richard was right about you. You always were a disappointment. She spun on her heel. She marched down the narrow hallway. She did not bother putting her boots back on. She carried them, her stockinged feet hitting the linoleum with heavy thuds. She grabbed the doorknob, wrenched the door open, and slammed it shut behind her. The impact rattled the picture frames on my living room wall. I stood in the silence of my kitchen. The emotional tether that had bound me to my mother for 33 years snapped. There was no grief. There was only a profound, terrifying lightness. I was finally unmoored. I walked over to the sink. I picked up the ceramic mug and turned on the hot water, scrubbing the red lipstick stain until the room was pristine white again. As I placed the clean mug on the drying rack, my cell phone vibrated on the counter. It was a loud, demanding buzz. I dried my hands and picked up the device. The caller ID flashed across the screen. It was not Richard calling to threaten me. It was not Derek calling to beg. It was Maya, Derek's wife, a partner at one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in Portland. Maya and I did not speak. We only exchanged polite nods at sterile family holidays. She was sharp calculating and deeply embedded in the Sterling family wealth. If Maya was calling me before 8 in the morning, the blast radius of the Thorne dinner had already breached her walls. I swiped the screen and lifted the phone to my ear, preparing to face a brand new enemy. The caller ID flashed Maya's name. I answered on the third ring. I did not offer a polite greeting. We are meeting in 20 minutes, Maya stated. Her voice held the chilling precision of a woman who destroyed corporate executives for a living. The roasting company on Exchange Street. Bring your laptop. Do not make me wait. She disconnected before I could reply. Maya was a partner at a premier litigation firm. She married Derek 5 years ago. I always wondered why a woman with a lethal intellect and a 7-figure billing rate chose a man whose greatest achievement was a low handicap on the golf course. The answer was the Sterling legacy. Maya traded her pedigree for the illusion of generational wealth. She thought she was marrying into an empire. She had no idea she bought a ticket on a sinking ship. I grabbed my coat and left the apartment. The drive downtown was silent. The coffee shop was a stark, minimalist space. Concrete floors exposed ductwork and a freezing draft that swept through every time the heavy glass door opened. Maya sat at a corner table. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer that looked sharper than a scalpel. A pristine leather briefcase rested on the chair beside her. She did not have a drink in front of her. She was not here to socialize. Sit, she instructed. I pulled out the metal chair. The scrape against the concrete echoed in the quiet room. I placed my leather tote on the table. Derek came home last night looking like he had seen a ghost. Maya began, her dark eyes locking onto mine. He locked himself in his study. He poured 3 fingers of scotch and told me the Thorne deal was stalling because of a technical glitch. But Derek is a terrible liar. He started pacing. He muttered about server access and metadata. He mentioned your name 12 times in 10 minutes. Maya leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. I woke up early this morning and pulled the public filings for Sterling Logistics. I also called a contact at the Regional Banking Authority. The operational liquidity is draining. Fast. The numbers Richard presented at the country club last month do not match the real-time debt load. Someone is cooking the books, Bernice. And you think it is me? I said. I think you are a disgruntled employee playing a dangerous game, Maya replied. You have the administrative keys. You control the routing algorithms. Richard treats you like a servant. You have the motive, the means, and the access to sabotage this buyout. If you are deliberately tanking my husband's future to settle a petty family score, I will bury you. I will tie you up in civil litigation for the next decade. You will never work in financial strategy again. She delivered the threat without raising her voice. It was a calculated, surgical strike. Maya had the legal firepower to execute every single promise she just made. A lesser person would have panicked. A lesser person would have started defending their character. I reached into my tote bag. I pulled out my secure tablet. "You are half right," I said, placing the device on the table. "Someone is cooking the books, but you are looking at the wrong suspect." I unlocked the screen. I opened the encrypted drive containing the raw, unedited financial ledgers I had extracted last night. I slid the glass rectangle across the table. "Look at the data, Maya. You are a litigator. Follow the money." Maya narrowed her eyes. She looked from my face to the glowing screen. She pulled the tablet closer. I watched her scan the spreadsheets. I watched her pupils track the columns of red ink. I had spent years masking those deficits. I knew every bleeding wound in the company's architecture. "This is the real balance sheet," I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. "Sterling Logistics is insolvent. The shipping fleet requires millions in deferred maintenance. The fuel vendors are operating on net 90-day terms because I have been begging their accounts receivable departments for extensions. Richard's legacy is a hollow shell." Maya swiped to the next tab. The hostile energy radiating from her shoulders began to dissipate, replaced by the rigid stillness of a predator realizing it had walked into a trap. "These debt ratios are fatal," she whispered, her legal mind processing the sheer scale of the ruin. "Richard told me the revenue was climbing." "Richard lies to everyone," I said. "I have been juggling angry creditors for years just to keep the lights on. I wrote the Thorne buyout proposal as a desperate Hail Mary to save the company. Why would I sabotage the only lifeline we have left?" Maya stared at the screen. The logic was undeniable. I had no reason to sink a ship I was working so hard to patch. She let out a slow, measured breath. The accusation hanging between us evaporated. "Then why did Derek come home terrified?" she asked. "Why was he rambling about metadata?" "Because he knows Thorne demanded the real architect of the deal," I answered. "Thorne knows Derek is a fraud." But that is only half the story. I reached across the table and tapped the screen. I opened the third tab on the ledger. It was the monitoring log I had recorded at midnight, the digital trap I set for my stepbrother. "I want you to look at the operational expense accounts," I instructed. "Look at the outbound wire transfers over the last 14 months. Maya scrolled down the page. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together. "These are phantom vendors," she noted, tapping a finger against a recurring outflow. "Consulting fees, offshore logistics analysis. The routing numbers do not match any known shipping partners in Maine." "Exactly," I said. "The company is bleeding out because of the debt, but it is hemorrhaging because someone is actively siphoning the remaining liquidity from the inside." Maya zoomed in on the routing numbers. Her eyes scanned the destination banks. She paused. A subtle tremor traveled through her hand. She recognized the financial institutions. She recognized the digital footprint. "Cayman Island proxies," she murmured. Her voice lost its sharp edge. It sounded hollow. "I traced the terminal IP address for those transfers last night," I revealed. "The requests did not originate from my desk. They originated from the executive suite, from your husband's secure terminal." The silence in the coffee shop became deafening. The hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter faded into static. Maya stared at the phantom transfers. The man she married, the man she believed was building an empire, was systematically robbing his own father and hiding the cash in offshore accounts. She looked up at me. The hostility was gone. In its place was a cold, terrifying realization. We were sitting on opposite sides of the table, but we were standing on the same collapsing floor. The Sterling men had deceived us both. They used my brain to keep the company alive, and they used Maya's legal pedigree to shield their social status, all while draining the vault behind our backs. He is shorting the company. Maya stated the reality settling over her features like a mask of ice. He assumes the Thorn deal will fail. I agreed. He knows Richard is incompetent. He is looting the remaining cash reserves before the federal auditors arrive. And last night, he tried to alter the server metadata to frame me for the missing funds. Maya leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, the litigation partner was back, but her target had shifted. The loyalty she held for Derek vanished, replaced by the instinct for pure, unadulterated survival. Derek handles our personal finances, Maya said, her tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. He told me he needed a signature for a routine home renovation permit last month. The document was buried in a stack of insurance renewals. She opened her pristine leather briefcase. She pulled out her own laptop. Her manicured fingers flew across the keyboard. She bypassed her firm's security protocols and logged directly into a regional banking database. She typed her social security number into the search field. I watched her face. I watched the blood drain from her cheeks. The polished, untouchable attorney suddenly looked very fragile. It was not a renovation permit, Maya said. She turned her laptop around so I could see the screen. A secondary home equity line of credit glowed on the display. It was drawn against their suburban estate. The balance was maxed out. The signature at the bottom of the digital contract belonged to Maya, but it was a flawless, undeniable forgery. He forged your name, I breathed, the sheer audacity of Derek's crime settling over the table. He leveraged my house to cover his margin calls on the shorted stock, Maya confirmed. Her voice was no longer hollow. It was sharp as shattered glass. If Sterling Logistics goes under, Derek's proxy accounts vanish into the Caymans. But the bank will come after my assets to settle this forged loan. He is leaving me to take the financial hit. The trap Derek built for me was identical to the trap he built for his own wife. He needed scapegoats. He needed us to absorb the blast radius of his greed. Maya closed her laptop. She looked at me, a silent pact forming in the freezing air between us. The Sterling men thought we were disposable utilities. They thought the waitress and the trophy wife would quietly fall on their swords. Thorn gave Richard 48 hours, Maya stated, snapping her briefcase shut, which means we have less than 36 hours to dismantle them before they dismantle us. She reached across the table and extended her hand. It was not a gesture of family warmth. It was a treaty between mercenaries. I need access to those server logs, Maya demanded, a terrifying new plan igniting in her dark eyes. If I'm going to draft the divorce papers and the asset protection injunctions, I need the raw data. What is your next move? I looked at the forged loan document reflecting on the dark screen of her laptop. My finger hovered over the power button of my own tablet. I am going to pull the plug, I answered. The hook was set. The alliance was forged. But as I packed my bag, a sudden, jarring notification chimed from Maya's phone. She glanced at the screen, and the color she had just regained vanished once more. We have a problem, Maya whispered, turning the screen toward me. Richard just called an emergency meeting with the dock union leaders for tomorrow morning. He is planning to lock them out. Richard just called an emergency meeting with the dock union leaders for tomorrow morning, Maya whispered, turning her phone screen toward me so I could read the encrypted text message from her informant. He is planning to lock them out. The words hung in the freezing air of the coffee shop. A lockout meant an immediate strike. A strike meant no cargo moved across the Portland docks. It was a suicide tactic. Richard was trying to show Marcus Thorne that he could slash payroll and break the collective bargaining agreements to improve the bottom line. He cannot do that, I stated, calculating the immediate fallout. I hold the union contracts. The penalty clauses for a sudden lockout without mandatory arbitration will trigger immediate fines. The penalties alone will exceed our entire quarterly operating budget. He does not know that Maya replied, her dark eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. Richard thinks he can bully his way out of insolvency. He is panicking. And when entitled men panic, they break the machinery that keeps them alive. Maya pulled her laptop closer. Her manicured fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before she initiated a secure virtual private network tunnel. She bypassed the public commercial servers and logged directly into her law firm's proprietary intelligence database. The hostility she had directed at me 20 minutes ago was gone. She was no longer Derek's betrayed wife. She was a senior litigation partner hunting her prey. "Give me the exact routing numbers from those Cayman Island proxies," she ordered. I read the digits from my tablet. Maya entered the sequence into a specialized financial registry designed to track offshore shell corporations. The screen flickered as the software processed the international inquiry. Derek had never built a single thing in his life. Richard bought him a luxury sedan on his 16th birthday. Richard paid the exorbitant out-of-state tuition for a private university that Derek barely attended. When Derek graduated with a meaningless degree, Richard manufactured a vice president title for him, complete with a corner office and a corporate expense account. Maya had married the illusion of a self-made prince. She traded her grueling 80-hour work weeks for what she believed was generational security. She did not know her husband was a financial parasite, draining the host from the inside out. A progress bar filled on Maya's screen. A complex corporate structure tree materialized in stark black and white lines. The offshore accounts funnel into a holding entity called Horizon Ventures. Maya narrated, her eyes scanning the data blocks. Registered in Delaware, but the trading activity is hidden behind a blind trust. "Can you pierce the trust?" I asked. Maya offered a cold, humorless smile. I pierce trusts before my morning coffee. She executed a cross-reference query using Derek's social security number and the forged home equity loan records she had uncovered earlier. The database crunched the variables and merged the findings. The resulting ledger painted a picture of staggering betrayal. "Look at this," Maya said. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook with suppressed fury. I leaned over the metal table. Horizon Ventures was not a typical shell company designed to hide embezzled operational funds. It was an active brokerage account, and its primary trading strategy consisted of highly leveraged short positions. "He is shorting Sterling Logistics," I breathed, the sheer audacity of the scheme settling over my shoulders like a weighted blanket. "He is shorting the secondary market shares." "He is betting against his own father," Maya confirmed, tracing the transaction histories with a trembling finger. "He is intentionally draining the operational cash flow to ensure the company fails. If Thorne walks away and Sterling Logistics declares bankruptcy, the stock price craters. Derek will close those short positions and walk away with an 8-figure payout." The architecture of Derek's treason was breathtaking. He was not just stealing from the vault, he was engineering a controlled demolition of his family's legacy. But short selling requires immense margin capital, I pointed out, tracking the financial logic of his crime. If the stock price fluctuates upward, even slightly before the collapse, the broker issues a margin call. Derek does not have that kind of liquid cash. He spends his salary on tailored suits and golf club initiation fees. Maya stared at the glowing screen. The reality of her own peril hit her like a physical blow. "That is why he forged my signature," she said. Her voice dropped to a terrifying whisper. "He used the home equity line of credit to fund the margin accounts. My house, my credit, my name is on the collateral holding up his entire fraudulent bet. If the market turns against him, the bank forecloses on my estate." The dynamic in the coffee shop shifted permanently. We were no longer two women sharing a mutual suspicion across a metal table. We were soldiers standing in the same trench. The Sterling men viewed us as disposable utility belts. Richard utilized my intellect to fund his country club lifestyle while taking all the credit. Derek utilized Maya's immaculate credit score to bankroll his treason while smiling in her face at the dinner table. If Richard locks out the union tomorrow morning, I reasoned, connecting the final dots, the news will hit the local press immediately. The stock will take a massive dive. Derek is accelerating the timeline. He wants the company to fail before Thorne's 48-hour deadline expires. He wants his payout before anyone can look closely at the books. Which means my house gets seized by the bank if we do not strike first, Maya stated. She closed her laptop with a sharp snap. The litigation partner took full control of the narrative. "We have a mutual enemy," Maya said, looking directly into my eyes, "but we operate in different theaters. I control the legal battlefield. You control the digital infrastructure. We need a synchronized strike." I nodded, listening closely as she laid out the strategy. "I am going back to the office," Maya instructed. "I will draft an emergency ex parte injunction. I can freeze the home equity funds and place a legal hold on the Horizon Ventures brokerage accounts before the market opens tomorrow. I am also filing divorce papers, citing gross financial fraud. Derek will wake up tomorrow morning with no wife, no house, and zero access to his stolen capital." "And what do you need from me?" I asked. "I need you to paralyze," Richard Meyer replied. "If he locks out the union tomorrow, he will try to blame you for the operational failure. He will tell Thorne that you mismanaged the payroll and caused the strike. You need to pull the plug on the logistics network tonight. Leave him blind and helpless. Let Thorne see exactly who runs that company." The plan was ruthless. It was elegant. It required me to abandon every lingering shred of my traumatic need to protect the family that exploited me. I thought about the red lipstick stain my mother left on my favorite ceramic mug. I thought about the 12 years of deferred paychecks and the windowless cubicle. "I will initiate the withdrawal tonight," I promised. "I am unlinking my personal guarantees from the fuel vendors. I am revoking Richard's administrative access to the proprietary software. When he walks into the office tomorrow, the entire supply chain will be frozen." "Good," Maya said. She reached across the table. We shook hands. It was a cold, firm grip, a pact sealed in the shared fire of survival. Maya stood up, sliding her laptop into her pristine leather briefcase. "I will text you when the injunctions are filed. Keep your head down until the trap snaps shut." I watched her walk out of the coffee shop, her tailored coat cutting a sharp silhouette against the freezing Maine wind. I was no longer fighting a solitary war. I had an inside weapon. The dramatic irony of the situation was intoxicating. Richard and Derek were currently sitting in their executive suites, congratulating themselves on their respective schemes, entirely oblivious to the devastating storm gathering right inside their own family. I packed my tablet and headed for the door. I needed to return to my apartment and finalize the digital shutdown sequence. Every algorithm, every password, every vendor contract had to be meticulously severed from the Sterling network. But as I pushed the heavy glass door open, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. It was not a text message from Maya. It was an automated alert from the Sterling Logistics internal human resources server. I pulled the phone out and read the notification. The freezing wind whipped across my face, but I barely felt it. Richard was not just accelerating his timeline. He was actively hunting me. The alert stated that my corporate email access and physical building keycard had been scheduled for termination at 5 o'clock this evening. Richard was firing me. He intended to lock me out of the building before I could speak to Marcus Thorne, ensuring he controlled the narrative and cementing me as the scapegoat. I checked my watch. It was currently 1 in the afternoon. The 36-hour window Maya and I had just discussed evaporated into thin air. My digital perimeter, my access to the vendor accounts, my ability to revoke the software licenses would be severed in exactly 4 hours. I started running toward my car. The careful, synchronized strike planned for midnight was no longer an option. I had to detonate the system right now. The drive back to my apartment took 9 minutes. I treated every yellow light as a suggestion. Richard had scheduled my network termination for 5 o'clock. I had less than 4 hours to dismantle a corporate infrastructure I had spent 12 years building. I ran up the 3 flights of stairs to my unit, my boots thudding against the worn wooden treads. I unlocked the door, threw my coat onto the sofa, and dropped into the ergonomic chair in front of my desk. My custom-built computer tower hummed to life. The dual monitors cast a stark blue glow across the dim room. I cracked my knuckles. The panic that had gripped me outside the coffee shop faded, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I was not going to commit corporate sabotage. I was not going to delete a single file or wipe a single hard drive. Destruction of company property is a felony. I was going to do something far more devastating. I was going to stop working for free. I opened my primary browser and initiated what I called the Great Withdrawal. Phase 1 required severing the financial lifelines. I navigated to the vendor portals for our 3 largest diesel suppliers. Sterling Logistics ran a fleet of 50 commercial transport trucks. Those trucks required thousands of gallons of fuel every week. 3 years ago, when the company credit rating tanked, the fuel vendors threatened to halt all deliveries. Richard had ordered me to fix it. I fixed it by quietly linking my own personal bank account as a secondary guarantor, using my immaculate credit score to underwrite his failing empire. I opened the billing settings for each vendor. I highlighted my name. I clicked Remove. I deleted my routing numbers and erased my digital signature from the underwriting agreements. I reverted the primary billing method back to Richard's default corporate card. I knew that card was maxed out. When the transport drivers tried to fill their tanks tomorrow morning, the pumps would decline the transactions. The fleet would be paralyzed. Phase 2 involved the human element. The dock workers' union was already volatile. Richard, planning a lockout, would ignite a powder keg. For years, I had acted as the buffer between the angry foreman and the arrogant executive suite. I logged into the company exchange server and accessed the email routing rules. I selected every incoming address associated with union grievances, safety violations, and payroll disputes. I deleted my inbox from the destination field. I redirected the entire flow of incoming complaints directly to Derek's unmonitored email address. I set an auto-archive rule on my end to ensure no one could claim I ignored a critical alert. Derek wanted the title of vice president. Tomorrow, he would wake up to the reality of the job. Phase 3 was the crown jewel, the routing algorithms. When I first designed the proprietary logistics software to optimize our shipping routes, Richard scoffed at the development costs. He told me it was a waste of time and explicitly refused to reimburse me for the coding hours or the server hosting fees. He called it my little hobby. Because he refused to invest company funds, I quietly patented the software under my own independent limited liability corporation. Sterling Logistics did not own the code. They were simply using it on an indefinite, unpaid trial basis. I opened my LLC dashboard. I pulled up the active enterprise license key assigned to the Sterling network. I did not terminate the program immediately. A sudden blackout during operating hours could be argued as illegal interference. Instead, I modified the licensing terms. I set the software to enter a mandatory grace period. At exactly 6 a.m. tomorrow, the algorithms would freeze. The dispatch screens across the Portland warehouse would lock, displaying a stark warning that the license had expired. Only the software owner could renew it. I checked the clock on my lower right monitor. It was 3 p.m. 2 hours left until my corporate access evaporated. It was time for Phase 4, the final nail in the digital coffin. I pulled up the master security protocol for the back-end servers. During the dinner with Marcus Thorne, Derek had received a barrage of 2-factor authentication alerts on his phone. He assumed it was a glitch. He ignored them. He did not realize those alerts were generated by a migration script I had triggered from my own device under the table. I had been slowly transferring the master administrative privileges away from his terminal and consolidating them into an encrypted token on my personal drive. I typed the final execution command into the terminal window. A prompt appeared asking me to confirm the revocation of all executive access tiers. I pressed the Enter key. The system executed the hard reset. I watched the Active Directory repopulate. Derek's user profile dropped from a full access administrator down to a restricted read-only guest. He could no longer alter metadata. He could no longer access the offshore proxy ledgers. He was permanently locked out of the financial architecture he had tried to manipulate. The trap he had built for me was dismantled, and the evidence of his attempted fraud was safely secured on my external hard drive. The digital bomb was armed. It would detonate sequentially as the sun rose over Casco Bay tomorrow. I leaned back in my chair. My muscles ached. The adrenaline crash was setting in, but the task was not finished. A withdrawal requires a formal exit. I opened a blank word processing document. I selected a standard serif font. I did not write a lengthy manifesto detailing my grievances. I did not mention the unpaid overtime, the disrespect, or the red lipstick stain on my coffee mug. The men who ran Sterling Logistics did not care about my feelings. They only cared about my utility. I typed exactly 2 sentences. Effective immediately, I resign from my position as financial strategist at Sterling Logistics. I revoke all implied and explicit personal guarantees previously extended on behalf of the company. I printed a single physical copy. The printer hummed, sliding the crisp white sheet of paper onto the output tray. I signed my name at the bottom in blue ink. I grabbed my coat and left the apartment. I drove back downtown toward the Sterling corporate headquarters. The winter sky was already turning the color of bruised iron as the sun dipped below the horizon. The office building was a sleek glass structure near the waterfront. I parked in the visitor lot. I did not use my reserved spot. I walked through the revolving doors and approached the security turnstiles. I checked my watch. It was 4:45, 15 minutes before Richard terminated my keycard. I tapped my badge against the scanner. The light blinked green. The glass barriers slid open. I took the elevator to the executive floor. The suite was quiet. The administrative assistants had already left for the day. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I walked past Derek's corner office. The door was shut, but I could see a sliver of light underneath. He was likely inside, blissfully unaware that his digital keys had been confiscated and his wife was currently drafting his financial ruin. I reached Richard's office. The heavy mahogany door stood ajar. He was not at his desk. A half-empty glass of scotch sat next to his keyboard. A stack of union contracts rested near his phone, waiting for my review. He expected me to arrive early tomorrow to sort out the mess he had created. I stepped into the room. The air smelled of expensive leather and stale cigars. I walked over to his massive oak desk. I took the single sheet of printed paper from my bag. I placed the resignation letter directly in the center of his keyboard. I aligned the edges perfectly with the keys. I turned around and walked out. I did not look back. I took the elevator down to the lobby. I walked out into the freezing Portland evening. The icy wind hit my face, but I felt a profound, radiant heat spreading through my chest. The heavy yoke of functional over-responsibility had been lifted. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I held the power button down until the screen went black. I was severing all lines of communication. Richard could not call me to demand help. Patricia could not text me to hurl insults. I was a ghost. I drove home in glorious silence. I made a simple dinner. I drank a glass of water. I went to bed early. I slept through the night for the first time in 12 years, knowing that while I rested, the explosive chain reaction I had engineered was silently ticking down toward Monday morning. I woke up at 5:30 on Monday morning. I did not set an alarm. My internal clock was wired to the brutal demands of the logistics industry. For over a decade, this was the hour I dragged myself out of bed, brewed a pot of bitter coffee, and began putting out the fires my stepfather ignited the day before. Today, the apartment was silent. The radiator hissed a steady, rhythmic breath. I walked into the kitchen, ground fresh beans, and poured myself a cup. It tasted rich. It tasted like freedom. I carried my ceramic mug to the desk. I turned on my secondary laptop. I did not access any Sterling Logistics secure networks. I did not need to risk a digital footprint. The beauty of a supply chain collapse is that it happens in plain sight. I navigated to the Maine Department of Transportation web portal and pulled up the live traffic cameras for the Casco Bay port terminals. At exactly 6 o'clock, the first wave of Sterling transport trucks rolled down the commercial access road. The 18-wheelers were painted a distinct slate gray, their trailers loaded with perishable cargo meant for the early distribution routes. The lead driver pulled up to the automated customs gate. The mechanical arm remained down. I watched the grainy footage as the driver leaned out of his cab to scan his digital manifest. The scanner flashed red. The authorization codes had expired at midnight. Usually, I updated the cipher keys manually while eating breakfast. Today, the system hit a dead end. Within 15 minutes, a dozen trucks piled up behind the leader. The access road choked. Brake lights illuminated the pre-dawn fog like glowing embers. The Port Authority guards stepped out of their booths, waving their flashlights, arguing with the drivers. The gridlock bled onto the main interstate. The invisible engine of Sterling Logistics had stalled, and the entire city was beginning to feel the friction. The customs blockade was only the first domino. At 6:30, I opened a separate browser tab to monitor the regional commercial fuel indexes. I pictured the scene unfolding at the truck stops along the northern highway routes. The drivers who bypassed the port to hit the interstate stretches were pulling up to the diesel pumps. They swiped their corporate cards. The digital screens returned a stark message. Transaction declined. By removing my personal bank routing numbers from the vendor underwriting agreements, the billing system reverted to Richard's default corporate account. That account carried a toxic credit score. Without my immaculate financial history shielding him, the fuel vendors instantly triggered their default protocols. They demanded cash on delivery. Transport drivers do not carry thousands of dollars in cash. They were stranded on the icy shoulders of the highway, their engines idling, burning the last fumes of their reserve tanks. Across town in his upscale suburban home, Derek was waking up to a digital nightmare. I knew exactly how his morning was unfolding because I had engineered the trap. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, expecting to see his usual golf tee time confirmations. Instead, the device was paralyzed under the weight of hundreds of unread emails. The redirection rules I instituted on the Exchange server were working perfectly. Every frantic message from the stranded drivers, every furious inquiry from the Port Authority, and every angry threat from the union foreman bypassed the executive filters and dumped directly into Derek's unmonitored inbox. The foremen were demanding answers about the expired codes. They were citing safety violations for the drivers stranded in freezing temperatures without fuel. Rumors of Richard's planned lockout had leaked, turning the confusion into raw, unadulterated rage. Derek tried to log into the company intranet to issue a system-wide override. He typed his credentials with shaking fingers. The server authenticated his username, but the dashboard he expected to see was gone. A gray, restricted screen appeared. Guest access only. The master administrative privileges he thought he possessed had vanished. He was a vice president locked out of his own vault, staring at a tidal wave of labor disputes he possessed zero competence to resolve. At 8 o'clock, the true architect of the disaster walked into the sleek glass headquarters downtown. Richard arrived expecting the smell of fresh coffee and a manicured crisis plan waiting on his desk. He stepped out of the executive elevator. The administrative floor was a hive of pure panic. Phones rang in a chaotic, overlapping symphony. Junior clerks sprinted down the hallways holding stacks of declined vendor invoices. Richard ignored them. He stormed toward my cubicle, preparing to hurl orders, preparing to demand why the waitress had not fixed the morning hiccups. He rounded the corner and stopped dead. My desk was bare. The dual monitors were dark. The personal notebooks, the ergonomic pen, the small potted plant I kept by the window, everything was gone. The space was a sterile void. A cold dread finally pierced his arrogance. He turned and sprinted toward his own mahogany doors. He burst into his office. He saw the single sheet of crisp white paper resting perfectly in the center of his keyboard. He snatched it up. He read the 2 sentences. Effective immediately. I resign. I revoke all implied and explicit personal guarantees. He crushed the paper in his fist. He lunged for his leather chair, grabbed his mouse, and clicked the icon for the proprietary routing software. He needed to manually force the customs codes to the drivers. The loading screen appeared, but the familiar map interface never populated. Instead, a stark, unyielding dialog box materialized in the center of the monitor. License expired. Contact software administrator. The algorithms that governed his entire shipping fleet were frozen behind a digital wall he could not breach. He was not the owner. He was merely a tenant, and he had just been evicted. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him. The trucks were gridlocked. The vendors were demanding cash. The union was sharpening their knives. His son was legally paralyzed, and the woman who had silently carried the weight of his incompetence for a decade had vanished into the ether. Desperation overrides pride. Richard picked up his desk phone. His hands shook so badly he misdialed twice. He called the private New York office of Marcus Thorne. He needed an extension. He needed the billionaire to advance a fraction of the buyout capital to unfreeze the fuel accounts. The line clicked open. Thorne did not answer. His executive assistant, a woman whose voice carried the warmth of a glacier, spoke instead. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone clipped and precise. "Mr. Thorne is currently unavailable. He asked me to remind you that the 48-hour deadline expires tomorrow evening. Until you present a functional leadership team, he will not accept your calls." The line went dead. Richard dropped the receiver. The dial tone hummed a monotonous tune of failure. The Sterling Empire was drowning in a crisis manufactured entirely by their own arrogance. They had built a towering structure on a foundation of unpaid labor, and I had simply walked away, letting gravity do the rest. I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet apartment, watching the traffic cameras show the Portland docks grinding to a permanent halt. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The victory felt clean, but I knew men like Richard did not surrender when cornered. They lashed out. My burner phone, the prepaid device I bought to communicate solely with Maya, vibrated against the laminate counter. I picked it up. The text message on the screen was short, but it shifted the battlefield entirely. "Richard just authorized a blank check retainer for the corporate legal sharks," Maya wrote. "They pulled your original employment file. They found a trap door. Brace yourself." The burner mobile device vibrated against the kitchen counter, delivering a chilling premonition. Maya transmitted precisely one sentence, detailing our mutual adversary assembling his mercenary legal battalion. Within 30 minutes, a courier pounded upon my apartment door. He thrust forward a thick manila envelope, sealed with crimson wax. Inside rested a formal subpoena demanding my immediate presence at the towering downtown headquarters of a ruthlessly prestigious litigation firm. I dressed meticulously, donning a charcoal blazer designed to project impenetrable armor. The drive toward the financial district felt like marching directly into an execution chamber. The private elevator ascended 50 floors above the gridlocked maritime harbor. I stepped into a reception foyer wrapped in imported Italian marble. A receptionist directed me toward Conference Suite Alpha. Pushing through the heavy oak double doors, the ambient temperature seemingly plummeted 10 degrees. The environment reeked of expensive cologne and predatory confidence. My former patriarch sat at the head of a massive, polished mahogany table. His bespoke, tailored jacket hung perfectly, hiding the desperate panic undoubtedly churning beneath his ribs. Beside him lounged Marcus Thorne, designated proxy, a silent observer taking meticulous notes. On the opposite side stood 3 vastly overcompensated attorneys. The lead counsel introduced himself as Jonathan Pierce. This man possessed the cold, dead eyes of a seasoned apex predator. Behind him stood a junior associate, a brilliantly composed African-American woman named Chloe. She happened to be Maya's biological sister. Her presence here was not a mere coincidence. My clandestine ally had planted her own sibling inside the beast belly. Chloe kept her gaze fixed firmly upon a yellow legal pad, revealing absolutely nothing. Pierce slid an enormous leather-bound binder across the reflective wood surface. He spoke with venomous precision, outlining charges involving corporate espionage, deliberate operational sabotage, and grand theft regarding intellectual property. He painted a fictitious picture, portraying a bitter, low-level clerk holding a multinational logistics empire hostage. A decade prior, I joined this enterprise as a naive 22-year-old, desperate to satisfy crippling maternal medical debts. I possessed zero leverage back then, just a raw, untamed talent for predictive algorithms. Now, these powerful men sought to crush that exact same talent using the crushing weight of their immense wealth. I maintained total outward composure. My right hand drifted toward my briefcase, preparing to extract the independent limited liability registration documents. I officially owned the patent. The proprietary digital architecture belonged entirely to me. I took a deep breath, ready to obliterate their entire fabricated argument. Before my fingers could clasp the brass zipper, Pierce held up a single faded piece of paper. The document looked ancient, slightly yellowed around the edges. A sickening wave of visceral recognition washed over me. It was my original employment contract signed many years prior, when I remained too impoverished to afford decent representation. The attorney began reading a specific subsection buried deep within the microscopic print. Section 4, paragraph 9. He uttered a phrase that struck my chest like a physical blow. The shop rights clause. In American corporate jurisprudence, this specific doctrine dictates an inescapable trap. If any worker creates an invention utilizing employer resources, company time, or office hardware, the corporation receives an automatic, irrevocable, non-exclusive license to utilize that creation without ever paying royalties. Pierce smiled a reptilian grin, exposing perfectly bleached teeth. He noted that I utilized the internal mainframe network to test the initial beta version of the routing application. Therefore, the patriarch claimed total, perpetual ownership over the entire infrastructure. My carefully acquired independent patent meant absolutely nothing against this established legal precedent. The vast room began spinning. The recycled air grew dangerously thin. All my meticulous midnight planning, the complex data extraction, the elaborate trap I laid for the fraudulent son, everything depended upon my absolute control over those specific servers. If they possessed a permanent statutory right to bypass my digital locks, the blockade would immediately fail. The stranded transport fleet would refuel. The automated customs gates would swing open. The old man would secure his billionaire buyout, leaving me entirely destitute, while facing federal prison time for unauthorized computer access. The implications of the shop rights clause metastasized throughout my consciousness. Every late-night coding session, every skipped meal, every holiday spent debugging lines of complex logic now belonged to the very people who had consistently degraded my worth. They were legally stealing my intellect. I envisioned the immediate future with horrifying clarity. The federal marshals arriving at my door, the humiliating perp walk, the complete liquidation of my modest savings just to afford a rudimentary defense attorney. I had dared to challenge the ruling class, and they responded by weaponizing the justice system against my vulnerability. The sheer audacity of their theft left me breathless. Richard sat there radiating unearned victory. He had never written a single line of code, yet he manipulated the law to crown himself the creator. My stepfather leaned forward, resting both elbows upon the table. He offered a sickeningly paternal smile, dripping with condescension. He demanded I write down the master administrative passwords immediately. If I complied unconditionally, he promised to drop the impending criminal investigations. He would graciously allow me to walk away with a meager severance package. If I refused, Pierce promised to file an emergency judicial injunction, freezing all my personal bank accounts before noon. The sheer terror of absolute financial ruin paralyzed my vocal cords. I stared at the yellowed signature line, trapped completely by my own youthful ignorance. The pacing of the universe slowed to a suffocating crawl. The feeling of absolute defeat sank deep into my marrow. Listeners would surely wonder how anyone could possibly escape such an ironclad legal net. I had built a fortress to protect myself, only to discover the enemy held the original blueprints. The agonizing silence dragged stretching into unbearable minutes. I looked down at my trembling hands, realizing the full magnitude of their ambush. My brilliant strategy lay shattered upon the mahogany floorboards. But as my vision blurred, focusing entirely upon the faded ink, a subtle shift caught my peripheral vision. Chloe represented the invisible backbone of this prestigious firm. As an African-American woman navigating a predominantly white male enclave, she understood the dynamics of stolen credit better than anyone else present. She had spent years drafting brilliant legal briefs while senior partners collected the accolades. When Maya married into the toxic dynasty Chloe had warned her sister about, the pervasive rot hiding beneath their polished veneer. Now she stood as the ultimate inside operative. Chloe, the quiet junior associate, shifted her weight. She deliberately slid a secondary cardboard folder across the table, abruptly, knocking over a tall crystal glass filled with ice water. The sudden distraction forced Pierce to leap backward, cursing loudly, as the freezing liquid ruined his expensive tailored slacks. Amidst the brief, chaotic scramble, Chloe swiftly flipped open the damp folder, exposing a single, highlighted bank statement directly in my line of sight. It displayed a specific series of monthly wire transfers. The funds paying for the original server hosting fees did not originate from the general corporate ledger. They came from a highly classified offshore account belonging exclusively to Derek. My racing mind pieced the fragmented puzzle together instantly. If the enterprise never officially paid for the hardware utilized during the development phase, then the shop rights clause was entirely invalid. The corporation had essentially stolen the resources from themselves, negating any claim of legitimate investment. The war was far from finished. A new explosive conflict had just ignited, right there in the boardroom. The highlighted ledger entry Chloe had so strategically exposed upon the damp mahogany table fundamentally dismantled the ironclad legal net hovering above my head. Jonathan Pierce stared at the banking statement, his predatory confidence evaporating into the chilled, recycled air of the conference suite. The logic of the revelation was entirely inescapable. Derek had utilized an unauthorized, hidden offshore entity to pay for the external server hosting fees, deliberately bypassing the corporate accounting department to conceal his fraudulent short-selling activities from the federal regulators. Because the enterprise never officially subsidized the digital infrastructure, they possessed absolutely no legitimate claim of investment. The dreaded shop rights doctrine in American corporate law required documented financial sponsorship directly from the employer. Richard had spent years arrogantly refusing to fund my project, viewing my software development as a worthless hobby. And that very arrogance had just voided his only legal weapon. I calmly secured the brass zipper on my leather briefcase. I informed the highly compensated attorneys that any further attempts at intimidation would result in my filing immediate countersuits for malicious prosecution and corporate harassment. Richard sat frozen in his bespoke tailored jacket, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles trembled, utterly silenced by the absolute collapse of his ambush. I turned my back on the patriarch and walked out of the towering glass building, inhaling the freezing, unpolluted winter air of the harbor. The first major hurdle was cleared, but the blast radius of the collapsing empire was expanding rapidly across the city. I navigated the congested downtown traffic and returned to my modest apartment complex. The afternoon sky had turned the color of bruised iron, reflecting the impending financial storm sweeping through the maritime shipping district. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the residential lobby, a frantic figure emerged from the shadows near the brass mailboxes. It was Patricia. The sudden sight of my mother sent an involuntary shockwave of anxiety straight down my spine. For my entire life, she had meticulously cultivated the persona of a flawless, wealthy matriarch. Growing up in a dilapidated working-class neighborhood on the edge of the industrial zone, she had always viewed marriage strictly as an economic ladder. When she finally secured Richard and his logistics fortune, she weaponized her appearance, using immaculate grooming and expensive designer labels as an impenetrable shield against the poverty of her youth. Today, however, that protective armor was utterly shattered. Her expensive camel hair trench coat was severely wrinkled, thrown hastily over a mismatched, unbuttoned blouse. Her hair, normally sprayed into a rigid, perfect style, hung in jagged, unkempt strands around her face. Most shockingly, her signature crimson lipstick was violently smeared across her jawline. a visceral, undeniable symbol of her total loss of control. The carefully constructed domestic facade had completely crumbled under the weight of reality. She did not offer a customary greeting or ask about my well-being. She lunged toward me, her hands trembling wildly as she grabbed the lapels of my charcoal blazer. Her eyes were bloodshot, wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. The telecommunications network at their sprawling suburban estate had been ringing incessantly since dawn. With the transport fleet paralyzed and the supply chain flatlining, the aggressive institutional creditors had bypassed the corporate switchboard entirely and begun calling the residential landlines directly. Patricia revealed a catastrophic secret she had kept hidden for years, a testament to the toxic financial dynamics of her marriage. During the previous economic downturn, when the logistics enterprise first flirted with insolvency, Richard had convinced her to personally co-sign the massive commercial bridge loans to secure the required operating capital. He had assured her it was merely a temporary administrative formality, leveraging the equity of the marital estate. Now, with the stock price plummeting and the operational revenue entirely frozen by my digital blockade, the massive commercial banks were initiating immediate foreclosure protocols on her sprawling mansion. She was facing absolute personal bankruptcy, and the pristine social standing she had sacrificed everything to build was evaporating before her eyes. The lobby felt suffocatingly small as she backed me against the cold brick wall. She abandoned every lingering pretense of maternal affection, revealing the transactional nature of our relationship. Her voice echoed off the tile floors, escalating into a shrill, hysterical scream. She demanded the master administrative credentials for the server network. She ordered me to march back to the executive suite, log into the proprietary routing software, and restore the operational matrix immediately so the company could process the delayed shipments. Her words were laced with decades of toxic manipulation. She shrieked that I owed them my survival, weaponizing the basic provisions of my childhood against me. She claimed I was an ungrateful parasite who owed them my entire existence simply because they had provided a roof over my head and food on my plate after my biological father abandoned us. The psychological pressure was immense, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. This was the ultimate internal conflict. The ingrained trauma bond cultivated through 30 years of relentless emotional conditioning screamed at me to submit to my habitual, functional over-responsibility. The frightened child inside my mind desperately wanted to fix the machinery, soothe the angry adults, and restore the dysfunctional peace to avoid further punishment. I stared at the smeared red wax on her chin. I looked deep into the desperate, selfish eyes of a woman who had willingly sacrificed her own daughter on the altar of her financial security. The realization washed over me like a cleansing tidal wave, stripping away decades of programmed obedience. She did not love me. She only loved the utility I provided to maintain her country club membership and her luxury vehicles. The heavy, suffocating yoke of guilt simply dissolved into the freezing air. I gently but firmly removed her trembling hands from my jacket, refusing to engage in a physical struggle. I stood to my full height, feeling the absolute power of my newly claimed independence radiating through my veins. I looked directly into her frantic eyes and spoke with a soft, unbreakable clarity. "I don't owe you my blood to keep his ship afloat." Patricia gasped, stumbling backward as if I had struck her across the face. The ultimate rejection of her maternal authority left her utterly speechless, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved a heavy stock business card. Maya had provided the contact information for a ruthless, highly effective personal bankruptcy attorney during our strategic planning session at the coffee shop, anticipating this exact collateral damage. I pressed the small rectangular card into my mother's shaking palm. I told her to call the number immediately because the commercial banks would undoubtedly seize her luxury vehicles by Wednesday morning. I did not wait for a response or a rebuttal. I turned my back on the woman who gave birth to me and walked toward the stairwell, leaving her standing entirely alone in the dim lobby. That single decisive action severed the final emotional tether connecting me to the Sterling dynasty. I was completely free. The toxic loyalty that had bound me to their sinking vessel was permanently eradicated, leaving my conscience clear and my strategy unburdened. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs, my mind rapidly shifting toward the offensive phase of the war. The defensive posturing was officially concluded. Now, the orchestrated counterattack would commence. I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside the quiet sanctuary. I tossed my keys onto the granite counter and walked directly toward my desk, fully prepared to contact Maya and initiate the next phase of the digital blockade alongside my legal ally. However, as I booted up my encrypted secondary laptop, a startling notification flashed across the dark monitor. It was not a text message from my sister-in-law confirming the divorce filings. It was a highly secure direct video conference link. The sender identifier displayed the personal digital signature of Marcus Thorne. The notorious billionaire had not merely walked away from the ruined acquisition deal when Richard failed to deliver a functional company. He had utilized his vast corporate intelligence network to trace the proprietary software license directly back to my independent limited liability corporation. The screen blinked rapidly, indicating an incoming transmission from the apex predator himself. A new, vastly more dangerous conflict had just arrived directly at my doorstep, and the rules of engagement were about to change entirely. The encrypted monitor on Bernice's desk pulsed with a steady blue light. The notification indicated a highly secure video transmission originating from a private network. She recognized the digital signature immediately. Marcus Thorne possessed the resources to bypass standard firewalls and locate her independent server. She clicked the mouse to accept the connection. The screen flickered before revealing the sharp features of the notorious billionaire. He sat behind a massive desk in a room devoid of personal artifacts. He did not offer any customary pleasantries. He stated plainly that he had just formally withdrawn his entire acquisition offer from her stepfather. The logistics enterprise was officially classified as a toxic asset. He then instructed Bernice to board a private aircraft waiting at the regional aviation terminal by noon the following day. He wanted a face-to-face meeting in Manhattan. He terminated the connection before she could respond. The sudden summons introduced a completely different tier of warfare. Bernice spent the night meticulously compiling a massive collection of logistical data into a thick leather portfolio. Her entire life had been defined by surviving the treacherous undercurrents of a dysfunctional household. She was raised to be a silent shock absorber for the failures of arrogant men. Marcus represented the ultimate apex predator in the corporate ecosystem. He grew up navigating the brutal collapse of the Midwestern industrial sector during his youth. That harsh environment taught him to view corporate loyalty as a fatal weakness. He built his private equity empire by identifying distressed companies, stripping away the useless components, and retaining only the most valuable mechanisms. He clearly viewed her recent digital sabotage not as a criminal act, but as a highly successful audition for his inner circle. The following morning, Bernice drove to the private airstrip. A sleek silver jet waited on the tarmac. The flight down the eastern seaboard passed in total silence. She gazed out the small circular window, watching the frozen coastal landscape slip beneath the wings. She thought about the decades of emotional manipulation she had endured. Her stepfather had systematically degraded her self-worth while secretly relying entirely on her logistical genius to sustain his wealth. Her mother had enabled every single betrayal, choosing luxurious comfort over maternal protection. Derek had brazenly attempted to frame her for his own financial crimes. The sheer weight of their collective betrayal had finally forged a cold, impenetrable armor around her heart. She was no longer interested in seeking their validation. She was entirely focused on executing a flawless sequence of systematic retribution. A black luxury sedan transported Bernice from the landing strip directly to a towering skyscraper in the financial district. She rode a silent elevator to the penthouse level. The doors opened into a cavernous boardroom wrapped entirely in reinforced glass. The panoramic view of the sprawling metropolis below served as a constant reminder of the immense wealth and power concentrated within these walls. Marcus sat at the far end of a long marble table. He gestured for her to sit opposite him. He began the negotiation by offering a staggeringly lucrative proposition. He wanted to hire her as the chief technology architect for his global supply chain division. The base salary he quoted was astronomical. He included a signing bonus substantial enough to completely erase the massive debts her mother had foolishly accumulated. He promised total creative control over the network architecture. It was the exact type of comfortable, highly compensated servitude that most ambitious professionals would immediately accept. He assumed her ultimate goal was simply escaping the toxic grip of her stepfather and achieving financial stability through a generous corporate benefactor. Bernice listened to his entire pitch without breaking eye contact. She absorbed the magnitude of his offer, and then she flatly refused. She stated clearly that she did not travel across state lines merely to exchange one domineering patriarch for another. The long era of providing invisible labor to enrich wealthy men had permanently concluded. She pushed the heavy leather portfolio across the smooth marble surface. She instructed him to open the document and review the detailed financial modeling inside. She had utilized a strategic framework based on the systematic architecture of automated financial growth. This complex model allowed her to predict the cascading effects of regional supply chain failures with terrifying accuracy. She had integrated advanced concepts of structural optimization and tax alpha to highlight exactly how rapidly his profit margins would evaporate. Marcus opened the folder. His confident demeanor shifted slightly as he scanned the highlighted data points. Bernice explained the grim reality of his current situation. He owned numerous massive maritime conglomerates that actively utilized the exact same Portland port terminals as her former employer. Her proprietary algorithms did not function in a vacuum. They served as the foundational digital nervous system for the entire regional customs grid. By permanently locking her stepfather out of the routing software, she had inadvertently orchestrated a massive physical gridlock at the shipping docks. This paralyzing traffic jam was expanding exponentially every single hour. She detailed the exact timeline of the impending catastrophe. The customs databases required constant algorithmic recalibration to process the massive influx of international shipping containers. Without her proprietary code running the background verifications, every single crane operator and dock worker would be legally forbidden from moving any freight. Within 7 days, the bottleneck would directly impact his own cargo ships. Millions of tons of perishable goods belonging to his subsidiaries would rot in the harbor. Hundreds of commercial vessels would be denied entry due to the systemic failure of the automated authorization gates. She had effectively taken his highly lucrative existing portfolio hostage. The very digital weapon she used to destroy the logistics firm was now pointed directly at his primary revenue stream. He possessed no alternative software capable of untangling the mess in time to prevent massive quarterly losses. The silence in the boardroom grew incredibly dense. Marcus stared at the irrefutable evidence of his vulnerability. He asked Bernice what she wanted to release the digital blockade. She told him she demanded a formal 50-50 joint venture. They would establish a brand new corporate entity. She possessed the intellectual brilliance and the cryptographic keys to control the regional transportation grid. He possessed limitless capital and the aggressive legal teams required to execute a hostile takeover. Her strategy was exceptionally simple, yet brutally effective. They would allow the Sterling family enterprise to bleed out completely over the next month. They would manipulate the debt restructuring process using their superior liquidity. Once the federal courts ordered a mandatory liquidation of their assets, their new partnership would purchase the warehouses, the maritime contracts, and the massive vehicle fleet for pennies on the dollar. Bernice was no longer interested in mere survival or petty retaliation. She wanted to conquer the very empire that had attempted to enslave her. She wanted to own the physical infrastructure while controlling the digital brain. Marcus closed the leather folder. He leaned back in his chair and studied her face for a long time. He was completely stunned by the sheer ruthlessness and the flawless tactical brilliance of her proposition. He realized she was not a disgruntled employee seeking a quick payout. She was a sovereign architect demanding an equal throne. A slow, predatory smile finally spread across his face. He extended his right hand across the marble table. He agreed to every single term without any further hesitation. The partnership was forged in the cold calculus of mutual domination. Bernice walked out of the towering skyscraper feeling a profound sense of transformation. The frightened young woman who used to fetch coffee for arrogant executives was dead. She was returning home as a conquering force, backed by billions of dollars in aggressive capital. The plan was in motion, and the destruction of the old regime seemed entirely inevitable. As she stepped into the waiting luxury sedan to head back to the private airfield, her encrypted phone vibrated against her side. She retrieved the device and saw an urgent communication from her legal ally. Maya had sent a secured document outlining a massive complication. The federal bankruptcy judge recently assigned to oversee the impending liquidation proceedings was a man named Thomas Harrison. He was not an impartial judicial figure. He was a lifelong personal friend of her stepfather. They belonged to the same exclusive country club and had shared numerous shady financial investments over the decades. The old patriarch had one final deeply corrupt political maneuver left to play. The battlefield had just shifted from the digital realm directly into a compromised court of law. The financial hemorrhage refused to remain concealed. By early Tuesday morning, whispers concerning our operational paralysis bled into the mainstream business press. Panicked rumors swiftly transformed into screaming headlines broadcast across major global trading platforms. The minority investors, a conservative syndicate of venture capitalists who had passively funded this maritime empire for decades, finally broke their complicit silence. They forcefully demanded an emergency gathering at the towering downtown headquarters. These individuals represented old aristocratic wealth, people preferring to collect substantial dividends in comfortable ignorance. They possessed zero tolerance for public humiliation or volatile profit margins. I arrived at the expansive glass structure shortly before noon. My brilliant sister-in-law Maya accompanied me. As a highly successful African-American corporate attorney, her strategic intellect continually outpaced the entire legal department occupying this building. She carried heavy leather folders containing proxy authorization documents, legally granting us absolute voting authority on behalf of billionaire Marcus Thorne. His massive capital injection during a previous debt restructuring quietly secured a formidable block of minority shares. The arrogant incumbent leadership had completely overlooked this critical vulnerability. We entered the cavernous meeting chamber just as the proceedings commenced. The ambient atmosphere felt suffocatingly dense. The incumbent patriarch stood beside a polished mahogany podium, his expensive bespoke suit visibly damp with anxious perspiration. He was currently delivering a bombastic, desperately loud address to the assembled financiers. He aggressively dismissed the catastrophic supply chain gridlock as a temporary, insignificant technical glitch. Gesturing wildly toward a glowing projection screen, he blamed the widespread maritime bottleneck on a disgruntled former employee attempting petty extortion. He expanded his chest, projecting a completely fabricated aura of supreme invincibility. He boldly guaranteed that his ironclad vendor agreements and unparalleled shipping dominance would easily secure their projected quarterly profits. The dramatic irony hanging in the room felt almost poetic. Maya and I exchanged a brief, silently knowing glance. We knew those contracts were entirely worthless. Our new coalition had already legally poached every single major international shipping route during clandestine midnight negotiations. My former oppressor noticed our sudden arrival, causing his facial features to contort in absolute, uncontrolled fury. He slammed his heavy fist against the wooden podium, loudly demanding security personnel remove us from the private premises immediately. Maya calmly stepped forward, placing the thick proxy authorization folders onto the smooth marble surface. She clearly articulated our lawful right to attend, observe, and participate, silencing his frantic outburst instantly. The tyrant sneered, rapidly adjusting his defensive strategy. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger in my direction, foolishly attempting to revive his deceased legal threat. He loudly proclaimed that the enterprise legally owned every single line of my proprietary code under the archaic shop rights doctrine. He confidently assured the terrified investors that his aggressive legal battalion would force me to surrender all administrative passwords before the financial markets closed today. He stubbornly insisted he held the ultimate winning hand. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, my posture radiating absolute, unshakable tranquility. I looked directly into the anxious eyes of the wealthiest shareholders. I began explaining a fundamental reality regarding complex logistical networks. Owning the source architecture on a static piece of paper is vastly different from possessing the intricate daily operational knowledge required to actually manipulate it. The digital matrix I designed did not function as a passive machine. It operated as a living, breathing technological organism. It demanded constant, active human recalibration to account for unpredictable weather anomalies, rapidly fluctuating global fuel prices, and constantly shifting international customs regulations. I extracted a sleek digital tablet from my briefcase. To provide an undeniable demonstration, I accessed a hidden, secondary back door I had secretly woven into the very fabric of the port administration framework years ago. With one single deliberate tap upon the glass interface, I transmitted a remote termination command. The massive projection monitor covering the far wall instantly shifted from a reassuring blue navigation map to a violently flashing crimson warning screen. The remaining automated algorithms managing the local freight yards crashed simultaneously. Distant alarm klaxons echoed faintly from the industrial sectors miles away. The entire regional transportation grid was now completely blind. Utter chaos erupted around the long table. Wealthy men frantically loosened their silk ties, shouting furious questions. The disgraced executive turned violently toward his eldest son, ordering Derek to resolve the escalating crisis immediately. He screamed at his pampered heir to bypass my digital locks and manually restart the terminal authorizations. Derek stumbled out of his plush leather chair. His immensely privileged upbringing offered absolutely no preparation for this brutal public exposure. He had spent his entire adulthood coasting on flagrant nepotism, utilizing his unearned title to secure expensive golf club memberships while forcing me to manage his actual corporate responsibilities. He walked tentatively toward the main computer terminal, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip his expensive silver laser pointer. The small device slipped from his sweaty fingers. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor, rolling uselessly under a nearby chair. He stared blankly at the flashing red monitor, his mouth opening and closing rapidly, like a suffocating fish. He possessed absolutely zero technical competence. His complete, undeniable ineptitude was finally displayed under the harsh fluorescent boardroom lights for every single investor to witness. He could not decipher a single line of the complicated interface. I turned my attention back to the horrified syndicate members. I delivered my final, devastating ultimatum. I presented them with an exceptionally simple binary choice. They could choose to sink alongside the colossal, fragile ego of an incompetent patriarch, passively watching their immense fortunes evaporate into total bankruptcy. Alternatively, they could vote to immediately remove this toxic leadership regime, allowing my new partnership to restore the network, untangle the congested ports, and salvage whatever residual value remained within the company. The decision required absolutely no prolonged deliberation. The minority bloc unified instantaneously. A senior partner representing a prominent New York investment firm raised his hand, formally motioning for an immediate vote of no confidence. The subsequent tally was swift and completely unanimous. The metaphorical gavel fell with a heavy, irreversible thud. The tyrant was officially stripped of his chief executive title. His decades of tyrannical rule ended not with a dignified, celebrated retirement, but through a humiliating, ruthlessly executed public defenestration. He collapsed backward into his chair, resembling a defeated, hollow shell of a formerly powerful man. However, cornered predators frequently execute one last, desperate, unpredictable strike. As the corporate chamber began to slowly empty, my former oppressor slowly lifted his head. A dark, genuinely terrifying smile crept across his pale, sweaty face. He reached deep into his tailored jacket pocket and retrieved a thick, officially stamped legal document. He casually tossed the heavy paperwork across the marble table, letting it slide directly toward Maya. He began laughing. It was a dry, raspy, deeply unsettling sound that chilled the ambient air within the room. He calmly revealed that he had fully anticipated this exact boardroom mutiny. Precisely 60 minutes before the emergency meeting commenced, he had preemptively filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on behalf of the entire organization. By executing this drastic maneuver, he placed the corporate entity, including all disputed intellectual property, under the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal judicial system. Specifically, he ensured the highly sensitive case landed directly on the docket of Judge Thomas Harrison. Maya recognized the name instantly, her sharp eyes widening in genuine shock. This specific magistrate was not an impartial arbiter of justice. He was a lifelong personal friend of the ousted executive. They belonged to the identical exclusive country club and had shared numerous highly questionable financial investments over the past 30 years. My blood ran entirely cold as I read the top page. The document resting on the table was an emergency judicial decree signed just moments ago. The deeply corrupt judge had just issued a sweeping, draconian order, instantly freezing all my personal financial assets. Furthermore, the decree authorized the immediate seizure of my newly registered software patent under the completely fabricated guise of an ongoing federal investigation. The victory dissolved instantly into ash, replaced by the terrifying realization that the patriarch had effectively weaponized the highest levels of the United States government against my freedom. I was no longer merely fighting a disgraced businessman in a boardroom. I was suddenly battling the crushing, inescapable weight of a compromised legal system, and armed federal marshals were currently en route to my apartment. The chilling weight of the corrupt judicial decree rested upon the mahogany table like a venomous serpent. My former oppressor leaned backward into his plush leather chair, exuding a foul aura of premature victory. He genuinely believed his clandestine relationship with the compromised federal magistrate would serve as an impenetrable shield against our righteous offensive. The room felt completely devoid of oxygen as the remaining investors stared at the official government seal stamped upon the paperwork. I felt a fleeting surge of terrifying vulnerability, imagining armed federal marshals storming my private sanctuary. However, the disgraced patriarch had fundamentally miscalculated the intellectual depth of his adversaries. He assumed I was fighting this war completely isolated. He completely forgot about the brilliant legal minds standing quietly by my side. Maya did not flinch at the sight of the draconian injunction. Instead, a serene, profoundly calculating smile illuminated her elegant features. My extraordinary sister-in-law hailed from a formidable lineage of brilliant African-American civil rights litigators based in Atlanta, Georgia. Throughout her childhood, she absorbed the intricate mechanics of dismantling deeply entrenched institutional corruption. Her ancestors had systematically conquered systemic oppression by locating the hidden structural weaknesses within powerful fortresses. She understood a fundamental truth regarding wealthy, arrogant men who manipulate the judicial system. They frequently leave their own domestic flanks completely exposed. Maya recognized that while the corrupt judge could temporarily freeze my software patent, the federal bankruptcy filing offered absolutely zero protection against criminal financial fraud committed from within the family structure. The arrogant old man had erected a legal fortress to trap me, but he had accidentally locked himself inside with a voracious parasite. Maya stepped purposefully toward the center of the executive suite, directly interrupting the gloating tyrant. She politely but firmly instructed the departing syndicate members to return to their leather seats. Her commanding presence demanded absolute obedience. She opened her voluminous designer briefcase and extracted a towering stack of pristine, meticulously bound dossiers. She began walking slowly around the perimeter of the massive table, distributing the heavy documents to every single astonished financier. She did not offer a defensive rebuttal regarding the impending asset seizure. She executed a devastating flanking maneuver. She announced that she had recently employed an elite team of independent forensic accountants to thoroughly audit the internal corporate ledgers. The private investigators had successfully bypassed the encrypted layers of the executive financial network, tracing massive capital hemorrhages that predated my digital blockade by several years. The room fell completely silent as the wealthy shareholders opened the preliminary pages. I watched the color rapidly drain from Derek's face. The pampered heir apparent suddenly appeared physically ill, violently clutching the polished edge of the table for basic physical support. Maya began narrating the tragic, indisputable truth of the Sterling legacy. She directed the audience to examine a specific series of offshore proxy entities officially registered in the Cayman Islands. These shadowy holding corporations had been aggressively executing massive short sell orders against the primary logistics enterprise for the past 36 months. Essentially, an invisible entity had been consistently betting millions of dollars that the maritime company would fail, deliberately driving the stock value into an unrecoverable downward spiral. The ousted chief executive scoffed loudly, attempting to project an air of dismissive authority. He boldly claimed these transactions were simply aggressive tactics employed by rival international shipping conglomerates seeking a hostile takeover. Maya shook her head slowly, her eyes locking onto the older man with surgical precision. She politely instructed him to turn toward the final appendix of the financial report. The forensic investigators had utilized advanced metadata tracking to pierce the corporate veil of the Caribbean shell companies. They successfully traced the originating Internet protocol addresses responsible for executing every single catastrophic market manipulation. The devastating trades did not originate from a rival corporate headquarters situated in London or Tokyo. They were authorized directly from the primary residential network located inside the sprawling suburban Sterling estate. The revelation hung in the recycled air like a detonated explosive. Maya articulated the final, undeniable conclusion. The brilliant future visionary of the maritime empire had been systematically cannibalizing his own inheritance. Derek had secretly accumulated colossal gambling debts while cultivating an incredibly lavish underground lifestyle, entirely beyond his legitimate executive salary. To satisfy his ruthless creditors, he had weaponized his intimate knowledge of the company vulnerabilities. Whenever the organization secured a fragile operational victory, Derek would deliberately sabotage the progress and then massively short the stock, pocketing the illicit profits, while his father blindly blamed lower-level employees for the resulting financial deficits. The son had effectively hollowed out the entire corporate vessel from the inside long before I ever deployed my routing blockade. I observed the exact moment the father-son alliance permanently, violently shattered. The older man stared blankly at the irrefutable evidence documenting his beloved child-orchestrated betrayal. Decades of blind paternal devotion evaporated into a terrifying, primal rage. The patriarch unleashed a guttural, agonizing scream that echoed violently against the reinforced glass windows. He completely abandoned all remaining pretenses of dignified aristocratic composure. He launched his entire body across the expansive table, physically lunging directly toward his eldest child. His hands curled into desperate, vicious claws as he attempted to grasp the collar of the younger man's designer shirt. The older man shrieked incoherent accusations, expressing a profound, earth-shattering agony at being played for an absolute fool by his own flesh and blood. Derek cowered, pathetically tumbling backward over his expensive office chair to escape the terrifying wrath of his creator. The pampered heir crashed heavily onto the carpeted floor, weeping openly while frantically attempting to deflect the crushing blame. He sobbed uncontrollably, screaming that the suffocating familial expectations had driven him toward financial madness. He blamed his father for demanding absolute perfection, while simultaneously refusing to relinquish any actual administrative control over the company. The pathetic display of generational cowardice thoroughly disgusted every single investor witnessing the chaotic meltdown. The Grand Dynasty was not merely falling, it was publicly devouring itself in a spectacular frenzy of greed and mutual resentment. Amidst the chaotic physical altercation, Maya moved with the serene grace of an apex predator circling a wounded quarry. She stepped smoothly around the thrashing bodies, ignoring the pathetic wailing of her soon-to-be former husband. She calmly reached into her tailored blazer pocket and retrieved a vibrant blue legal envelope. She tossed the document gracefully, allowing it to land squarely upon the chest of the weeping man sprawled across the floorboards. She announced clearly over the din of the shouting executives that she was officially serving him with comprehensive divorce proceedings. Furthermore, she notified him of a simultaneous catastrophic civil lawsuit. She possessed undeniable proof that he had criminally forged her signature to secure a massive, fraudulent home equity loan against her privately owned residential properties. She coldly informed him that she was completely severing his access to her generational wealth, permanently ensuring his impending transition into absolute poverty. The lead representative of the conservative venture capital syndicate finally recovered from his profound shock. He furiously smashed his hand against the intercom button, immediately summoning the private building's security forces. Within seconds, the heavy oak double doors swung open, revealing a half-dozen imposing armed guards. The uniformed personnel did not hesitate. They grabbed the disgraced patriarch by his arms, forcibly restraining him as he continued to thrash and scream obscenities at his treacherous offspring. Two other guards hoisted the sobbing, humiliated heir apparent, dragging him across the floor by his expensive leather belt. The board members watched in stunned silence as the two entitled men were physically, forcibly escorted out of the towering skyscraper they once ruled with absolute impunity. The implosion was total, breathtakingly public, and profoundly satisfying. The invisible, marginalized women had entirely dismantled the toxic power structure, utilizing nothing but the devastating strategic application of absolute truth. The executive suite descended into a profound, heavy silence following the violent departure. The remaining financiers quickly gathered their belongings, offering us respectful, terrified nods before hastily fleeing the scene of the corporate massacre. Maya and I stood alone amidst the scattered mahogany chairs, sharing a deep, silent acknowledgement of our monumental victory. The dragons were finally slain. However, the brief moment of triumphant relief was abruptly shattered by the gentle chime of the private elevator arriving at the penthouse level. The polished steel doors slid open, revealing the imposing figure of billionaire Marcus Thorne. He stepped onto the plush carpet, clapping his hands together in a slow, deliberately mocking applause. He commended our flawless execution of the hostile mutiny, but his facial expression remained entirely devoid of genuine warmth. Marcus walked slowly toward the head of the table, casually tossing a new sealed document onto the marble surface. He casually explained that while we were busy executing our brilliant familial revenge, he had been aggressively maneuvering his massive capital reserves behind the scenes. He revealed a terrifying new development regarding the corrupt federal judge managing the bankruptcy proceedings. Marcus had utilized his vast intelligence network to uncover the massive illicit gambling debts owed by the compromised magistrate. Instead of exposing the judge, Marcus quietly purchased every single financial obligation, effectively transforming the powerful legal official into his personal puppet. The billionaire stared directly into my eyes, his voice dripping with absolute cold malice. He informed me that the 50-50 joint venture we previously negotiated was officially terminated. With the Sterling family removed and the bankruptcy court under his direct control, Marcus no longer needed a partner. He intended to seize 100% of my digital architecture by sheer absolute force, leaving me entirely defenseless against a monster vastly more dangerous than the ones I had just destroyed. Marcus Thorne stood at the head of the mahogany table, radiating an aura of malicious triumph. He genuinely believed his clandestine purchase of the compromised magistrate gambling debts granted him absolute dominion over my proprietary digital architecture. The predatory billionaire expected us to cower under the immense weight of his aggressive wealth. Instead, Maya unleashed a resonant, deeply amused laugh that echoed sharply across the quiet executive suite. Her unexpected reaction entirely shattered his arrogant composure. My formidable legal ally calmly explained that anticipating judicial corruption constituted a fundamental operating procedure for any seasoned civil rights litigator. Her ancestors had spent generations battling entrenched systemic oppression, teaching her to never enter a hostile environment without securing a secondary defensive perimeter. While Marcus was busy acquiring the corrupt judge, financial obligations Maya had concurrently forwarded the comprehensive forensic evidence directly to the federal authorities. She politely informed the stunned investor that his expensive judicial puppet was currently facing a sweeping public corruption indictment. The compromised magistrate possessed zero legal authority to seize my intellectual property or freeze my personal assets. Thorne realized his elaborate ambush was merely a superficial trap we had allowed him to trigger. His sharp facial features darkened into a mask of pure, seething fury as the truth crystallized in his mind. He recognized he could not steal the valuable network infrastructure through manipulated gavels or empty threats. If he desired control over the maritime logistics sector, he would have to battle us openly during the legitimate municipal auction. He sharply pivoted and stormed out of the penthouse, leaving a lingering trail of shattered hubris in his wake. The immediate neutralization of the billionaire hostile maneuver allowed the natural consequences of the logistics empire's spectacular failures to accelerate drastically. Without my functional routing software to untangle the paralyzing maritime gridlock, and utterly devoid of competent executive leadership following the violent boardroom mutiny, the enterprise experienced a catastrophic systemic collapse. The massive commercial banks exhibited absolutely zero mercy toward the floundering organization. Within 48 hours, the aggressive institutional lenders officially declared comprehensive defaults across every single operational front. The merciless financial entities initiated swift foreclosure protocols, legally seizing the sprawling coastal warehouses, the enormous fleet of heavy transport vehicles, and the towering steel harbor cranes. The sheer magnitude of the corporate destruction completely dominated the front page of the Portland Business Journal the following morning. The bold, unyielding headlines painted my former oppressor as a spectacular cautionary failure of aristocratic arrogance. The elite society that had previously worshipped his immense wealth rapidly ostracized him. Richard transformed into a total social pariah almost overnight, permanently banished from his exclusive suburban country clubs and entirely shunned by his fellow wealthy investors. Humiliation frequently breeds a deeply dangerous, toxic form of psychological desperation within individuals unaccustomed to defeat. Stripped of his public dignity and forcefully cast out of his luxurious empire, the disgraced patriarch stubbornly refused to accept his newly impoverished reality. He retreated into the shadowy depths of the metropolitan financial underworld, seeking unconventional, highly hazardous avenues of capital resurrection. A brief examination of his professional background reveals a ruthless man who built his initial fortune during the aggressive deregulation era of the late 20th century. He fundamentally believed that administrative rules and legal boundaries only applied to the weak or the poor. Operating far outside the regulatory oversight of traditional banking institutions, the desperate old man successfully secured a massive, high-interest shadow loan from an unregulated private lending syndicate. To guarantee this extraordinary influx of predatory capital, he secretly leveraged his final remaining stronghold of hidden personal wealth. He pledged a clandestine offshore family trust he had meticulously concealed from both the federal tax authorities and his current panicked wife. He harbored a singular, obsessive objective to salvage his shattered ego. He fully intended to walk confidently into the upcoming municipal foreclosure auction, completely blindside his numerous adversaries with this sudden injection of untraceable liquidity, and forcefully buy back his entire physical empire. He wanted to definitively prove his inherent superiority to the minority shareholders who had so publicly humiliated him. While the fallen tyrant plotted his dramatic resurrection within the dark corners of the city, a vastly different atmosphere permeated my modest residential apartment. Maya and I sat comfortably on my plush velvet sofa, sharing a rare, deeply earned celebratory beverage. We gently clinked our heavy crystal glasses together, the golden amber liquid catching the warm, soft glow of the nearby standing lamp. We were actively watching the evening financial broadcast on the television, silently observing the polished news anchors dissecting the spectacular implosion of the Sterling dynasty with clinical fascination. The sweet taste of absolute victory was undeniable, yet a seasoned strategist understands that a wounded enemy remains exceptionally dangerous until their final economic breath is exhausted. I openly expressed my lingering concern regarding my former stepfather's notorious resilience and endless capacity for deceit. I knew he possessed hidden reserves of pure ruthlessness that could still pose a significant threat during the impending liquidation proceedings. I feared he might discover a hidden loophole to reclaim his throne. My brilliant sister-in-law took a slow, deliberate sip from her elegant glass, her dark eyes sparkling with profound tactical mischief. She calmly instructed me to immediately stop worrying about the old man hypothetical resurrections. She decided the perfect moment had arrived to reveal a critical, devastating piece of withheld information she had been orchestrating behind the scenes. Maya explained that during her meticulous compilation of Derek's disastrous financial records, she discovered a brilliant structural vulnerability directly linking the foolish son's fraudulent activities to the father's hidden assets. By effectively utilizing the explicitly forged home equity loan documents that Derek had so arrogantly executed, she established a concrete, irrefutable legal nexus between the two disgraced men. Operating with lethal, silent efficiency, Maya had quietly filed a massive emergency injunction within the civil courts earlier that very afternoon. This brilliant legal maneuver successfully and completely froze the exact hidden offshore trust Richard was currently attempting to use as primary collateral for his illicit shadow loan. The unregulated private lending syndicate would automatically deny the desperate patriarch access to the requested funds, the absolute moment they attempted to verify his pledged assets. The overarching narrative tension instantly shifted from defensive survival toward the final, absolute acquisition of the physical empire. The arrogant old man was unknowingly walking into a brutal financial war zone, carrying a completely empty weapon. He had absolutely no idea his clandestine funds were hopelessly blocked by the very judicial system he had previously attempted to weaponize against my freedom. I placed my empty crystal glass onto the polished wooden coffee table and reached for the thick, glossy document resting nearby. It was the official municipal auction catalog, meticulously detailing every single seized waterfront warehouse diesel transport truck and lucrative shipping contract previously owned by the logistics firm. I slowly turned the crisp white pages, carefully reviewing the immense inventory of ruined legacy. I was actively preparing to take my rightful dominant seat at the bidding table, armed with my invincible proprietary digital architecture and an unstoppable resolve. But as I reached the final page of the comprehensive catalog, a truly shocking detail emerged, leaving me completely astonished and breathless. The primary maritime terminal, the absolute crown jewel of the entire shipping network, was mysteriously absent from the standard municipal foreclosure inventory. A small, obscure footnote indicated the property had already been quietly acquired by an anonymous international holding corporation, introducing an entirely new, terrifyingly invisible adversary into the ultimate equation. The massive, imposing doors of the Portland Municipal Courthouse swung open heavily, revealing a stark, cavernous chamber. Harsh fluorescent lights cast severe, unyielding shadows across the polished granite floors, reflecting a deeply sterile environment, perfectly suited for the brutal final phase of corporate cannibalism. Today represented the ultimate dismantling of a regional monopoly. The disgraced patriarch occupied a prominent seat directly in the front row of the gallery. His physical appearance betrayed the agonizing, immense stress of recent weeks. Deep, heavy lines carved permanent valleys into his pale face, while his once broad, powerful shoulders appeared noticeably diminished under the weight of his public humiliation. Yet, despite his visible physical decay, a venomous, arrogant gleam danced within his cold eyes. He firmly clutched a numbered plastic bidding paddle, resting it against his tailored knee. He genuinely believed he possessed the ultimate secret weapon to secure his resurrection. During his aggressive ascension throughout the early 2000s, he frequently utilized unregulated capital to ruthlessly crush his younger competitors. He assumed his newly acquired predatory shadow loan would easily allow him to repurchase his stolen legacy for pennies on the dollar. He sat there silently, calculating his impending dramatic victory, entirely oblivious to the invisible legal trap already closing around his throat. Bernice stepped across the heavy threshold, moving with the calm, deliberate precision of an executing monarch. She wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. Every single trace of the submissive, frightened stepdaughter had been systematically eradicated through the fires of betrayal. She was flanked symmetrically by her two unstoppable, formidable allies. On her right walked Marcus Thorne, the notorious maritime billionaire, radiating cold, predatory confidence and representing limitless financial ammunition. On her left strode Maya, her brilliant African-American sister-in-law. Maya possessed a deeply rooted understanding of systemic dismantling, inherited from generations of elite civil rights litigators operating within the complex American judicial system. Her presence served as a walking physical manifestation of irrefutable legal truth. Together, the trio formed an impenetrable phalanx of intelligence, wealth, and strategy. The heavily crowded room fell completely silent as the appointed municipal administrator approached the elevated wooden podium. The official began reading the extensive, lengthy rules governing the public liquidation of seized commercial assets. Numerous minor logistical components were quickly sold off to various obscure transportation competitors, hoping to scavenge the remains. Pallets of outdated office equipment and forgotten suburban storage facilities disappeared into the administrative ether. The atmosphere grew incredibly dense and suffocating as the primary focus finally shifted toward the massive core distribution hub. This colossal warehouse network represented the beating mechanical heart of the entire defunct logistics empire. Whoever controlled this specific sprawling infrastructure would immediately dominate regional ground transportation for the next decade. The administrator formally opened the floor, asking for an initial, massive starting figure to commence the bidding war. Richard instantly thrust his numbered paddle high into the air. He loudly declared a sum completely shattering the estimated market value of the property. A collective, shocked murmur rippled through the gathered crowd of greedy spectators and rival executives. The old tyrant slowly turned his head, looking directly at Bernice. He offered a deeply smug, condescending smile, mistakenly believing his overwhelming display of financial force would frighten her into immediate submission. He assumed her newly formed coalition would flatly refuse to overpay for the physical buildings, regardless of their strategic importance. Bernice did not flinch or divert her steady gaze. She smoothly raised her own white placard matching his aggressive, arrogant stare with terrifying, detached tranquility. She immediately countered his massive offer, adding $5 million additional dollars to the already staggering total. She utilized Thorne's immense liquid capital reserves, effectively weaponizing the billionaire resources against her former abuser. The air inside the cold courtroom grew incredibly heavy, thick with unresolved generational animosity and pure, unadulterated vengeance. The arrogant older man scoffed audibly, shifting his weight aggressively in the stiff wooden chair. He prepared to unleash the full, devastating weight of his illicit underground syndicate funds. He opened his mouth, intending to double her latest astronomical bid and completely annihilate her challenge once and for all. Before a single syllable could escape his lips, the presiding auctioneer suddenly raised a hand, demanding immediate silence across the chamber. A junior court clerk rapidly approached the elevated platform, clutching a bright yellow legal folder. The young assistant frantically whispered directly into the ear of the primary administrator, while aggressively pointing at a specific, verified document contained within the file. The municipal official expression rapidly transformed from professional boredom into profound, serious concern. The administrator adjusted the microphone and delivered the catastrophic public decree. The official formally announced that the comprehensive proof of financial backing submitted by Richard earlier that morning had just been flagged by a severe federal banking system alert. The administrator clearly stated that an emergency civil injunction successfully executed by Maya had legally frozen the exact offshore trust accounts designated as the primary collateral for his private loan. Consequently, the unregulated lending syndicate automatically revoked their capital commitment to avoid judicial scrutiny. The old patriarch possessed absolutely zero functional liquidity. The auctioneer loudly declared the disgraced executive completely disqualified from participating in any further financial transactions upon those municipal premises. Richard froze in a state of absolute paralyzed horror. His jaw went completely slack, his eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for a sympathetic face among the sea of ruthless corporate vultures. There was none to be found. He had spent his entire adult life alienating every single peer through his boundless greed and toxic manipulation. He slowly lowered his useless plastic paddle, his entire fabricated universe shattering into millions of irreparable pieces right before his eyes. He was forced to sit in complete, silent, agonizing defeat, watching helplessly as the administrator formally accepted the final, staggering bid from Bernice. With one swift, heavy strike of the wooden gavel, she legally claimed absolute possession of every single tangible asset he had ever owned. The transfer of ultimate power was officially recorded into the municipal ledgers, permanently erasing the old legacy. The judge announced a brief 30-minute recess to allow the victorious parties to finalize the necessary administrative paperwork. The crowded chamber slowly began to empty as spectators shuffled out into the echoing marble corridors, discussing the historic corporate slaughter. Bernice remained seated, calmly organizing her own pristine legal documents. Richard slowly approached her table, his previous arrogant swagger entirely replaced by a pathetic, desperate shuffle. His breathing sounded shallow and uneven, echoing his shattered reality. The total destruction of his massive ego left him completely hollowed out, resembling a fragile, fragile ghost of his former, terrible self. He stood before her, completely broken, physically and spiritually. He quietly pleaded with her, invoking empty, meaningless sentiments regarding their shared history. He desperately begged her to remember they were legally bound as a family unit. He suggested they could somehow rebuild the shattered enterprise together if she simply granted him a minor advisory role within her newly conquered domain. He completely abandoned his lifelong pride, groveling openly for a tiny, insignificant scrap of mercy from the resilient woman he had relentlessly tormented for decades. Bernice slowly lifted her head, fixing her calm, dark eyes directly onto his trembling, pathetic form. She felt absolutely zero pity for the chief architect of her previous misery. She looked at him with profound, cold detachment. "I am just the waitress, Richard. I am here to clear the table." The utterly destroyed man finally turned away, vanishing into the cold city streets alone, stripped of everything he valued. Bernice gathered her things, feeling an immense wave of profound, satisfying closure wash over her tired spirit. However, The modern American corporate landscape rarely allows for a peaceful, permanent victory. As she approached the main registration desk to finalize the property deeds, she requested a brief clarification regarding the massive waterfront shipping terminal that had mysteriously vanished from the official inventory yesterday. The chief clerk reviewed a secure digital file and handed Bernice a single printed sheet containing the transfer details. The anonymous International Holding Corporation that preemptively purchased the crucial maritime docks was not a foreign competitor. Bernice scanned the encrypted registry data, recognizing a familiar hidden numerical pattern buried within the offshore routing details. It was a specific algorithmic signature she had personally taught Derek many years ago when he struggled to pass his university finance courses. Her cowardly, exiled brother had not simply gambled away his inheritance. He had utilized his public, pathetic meltdown as a brilliant, deceptive smokescreen, deliberately distracting the entire family while he quietly siphoned his illicit, short-selling profits to secretly purchase the most vital choke point of the entire regional transportation grid. Bernice realized, with a chilling surge of pure adrenaline, that the war was far from over. Derek now possessed the actual physical gates to the ocean, leaving her newly acquired inland empire completely landlocked and incredibly vulnerable to his impending extortion. 6 months have evaporated since the freezing, chaotic confrontation at the municipal courthouse. The terrifying revelation regarding the stolen maritime docks proved to be a remarkably short-lived victory for my cowardly brother. My brilliant African-American sister-in-law did not hesitate when presented with his algorithmic signature hidden deeply within the International Shipping Registry. Maya possessed a deeply ingrained ancestral understanding of how arrogant men carelessly leave digital footprints when attempting to execute complex financial crimes. She immediately transported the encrypted evidence directly to the federal financial oversight committees. Because the substantial capital utilized to purchase the critical waterfront infrastructure was undeniably traced back to the forged domestic equity loans and his prolonged illicit market manipulation, the United States government moved with unprecedented speed. The judicial authorities completely invalidated the anonymous holding corporation within a mere 72 hours. The federal courts formally seized the vital property, transferring absolute legal ownership directly into our possession as rightful, permanent restitution for the extensive damages he caused. Stripped of his stolen assets and facing severe, crushing civil penalties, the former heir apparent experienced a catastrophic descent into the brutal, unforgiving reality of the American working class. Today, he occupies a vastly different professional landscape, located incredibly far removed from his previous luxurious executive suites. He currently endures exhausting, grueling shifts, functioning as a low-level floor manager at a heavily discounted electronics retail chain, located inside a decaying, desolate suburban strip mall. His daily routine consists of dealing with irate customers and unloading heavy cardboard boxes filled with cheap plastic phone accessories. He must wear a brightly colored plastic name tag that lists him simply as a management trainee. When angry suburban mothers scream at him over expired television warranty policies, he cannot summon an aggressive legal team to crush them. He must simply apologize profusely and offer them a minor store credit. Furthermore, his meager hourly wages are aggressively garnished every single week by the relentless legal settlements Maya secured during their highly publicized, ruthless divorce proceedings. He spends his miserable afternoons organizing discount bins, providing a deeply poetic demotion for a man who once falsely claimed to be a visionary global logistics director. His former wealthy country club peers actively avoid making any eye contact whenever they happen to wander into his dreary store looking for cheap batteries. His mother suffered an equally devastating, precipitous fall from her imagined aristocratic grace. The frozen offshore trusts eventually dissolved under immense, microscopic federal scrutiny, leaving Patricia entirely bankrupt and legally exposed to multiple lawsuits. The sprawling, opulent suburban estate was unceremoniously liquidated by aggressive banking creditors to satisfy her husband's massive, outstanding financial obligations. the haughty matriarch who had spent her entire adulthood relying exclusively upon toxic marital wealth to shield her from the consequences of her profound cruelty, currently resides within a cramped, noticeably damp, two-bedroom apartment situated in an undesirable, noisy industrial neighborhood. She shares this tiny, depressing living space with her estranged younger sibling, a woman she had previously ignored and insulted for decades. The transition from a massive mansion to a tiny urban dwelling provided a brutal psychological shock. She must now navigate complicated public transportation systems, a terrifying daily ordeal for a woman who had not driven her own vehicle in 30 years. The arrogant socialite who once hosted lavish, expertly catered galas for the regional political elite now spends her bleak, quiet evenings meticulously clipping grocery store coupons from the Sunday newspaper. She desperately hunts for meager discounts on generic canned vegetables and bulk paper products. Her days are defined by an absolute, profound irrelevance, entirely forgotten by the high society circles she once ruthlessly dominated. The overarching narrative dramatically shifts away from those decaying remnants of toxic entitlement, moving purposefully towards a vibrant, booming ecosystem of modern commerce. The newly minted headquarters of Anderson Maritime pulses with immense, highly focused corporate energy. We completely gutted the old dark mahogany executive suites, replacing the suffocating atmosphere with bright, open-glass architecture and state-of-the-art technological interfaces. Sunlight streams constantly across the polished floors, illuminating a diverse workforce driven by genuine talent rather than flagrant nepotism. Maya comfortably occupies the prestigious corner office, officially serving as our highly respected chief legal officer. Her brilliant strategic mind ensures our massive shipping network remains permanently shielded from predatory outside investors and invasive regulatory interference. Together, we transformed a failing regional carrier into an unstoppable international logistics juggernaut, operating with unprecedented, staggering efficiency. The national business journals now view our operation as the absolute gold standard for global freight routing. Yet the absolute most profound manifestation of poetic justice greets me every single morning, right at the main glass entrance of our soaring corporate facility. The disgraced patriarch, the terrifying tyrant who spent countless decades dismissing my intellect and actively attempting to destroy my professional future, is now officially employed by my thriving enterprise. Through a beautifully crafted, deliberate stroke of irony, I hired Richard as a disposable independent contractor, operating strictly under a standard 1099 tax classification. He earns the absolute legal minimum wage permitted by local state law, completely stripped of any corporate benefits, healthcare coverage, or paid time off. His designated daily uniform consists of a cheap, poorly fitting synthetic blue polo shirt, prominently bearing my personal corporate logo across his chest. His sole humiliating professional responsibility involves standing near the automated security turnstiles, functioning as a mandatory warehouse greeter for visiting truck drivers and package delivery personnel. The physical toll of standing on hard concrete floors for 8 consecutive hours has aged him significantly. His knees ache constantly, and his previously immaculate, powerful posture has crumbled into a permanent, defeated slouch. Every time he sees my sleek black sedan pull up to the executive drop-off zone, a visible shudder of pure humiliation racks his frail body. He knows he cannot quit his miserable job because no other respectable company in the entire country will hire an elderly man so publicly branded by corporate scandal and complete financial incompetence. The deeply arrogant man who repeatedly humiliated me in front of wealthy investors and dismissively called me a mere waitress is now literally forced to hold the heavy glass doors open for me whenever I enter the building. He must utter a quiet, standardized corporate greeting while I glide past him entirely unbothered by his lingering, pathetic resentment. He watches my flawless ascent every single day, permanently trapped in a personalized purgatory of his own creation. This profound journey officially culminates inside the primary expansive executive boardroom perched at the highest level of the skyscraper. I stand confidently at the head of the brightly lit room, preparing to initiate our highly anticipated quarterly global strategy session. My assembled top executives, individuals chosen strictly for their exceptional competence and loyalty, stare at me with genuine, deep respect. My hands rest firmly upon the smooth, perfectly polished surface of a massive, brand-new oak table. The natural wood grain is flawless, radiating a quiet, undeniable strength. This custom table stretches across the center of the room, symbolizing transparency and collaborative power. It lacks the imposing, intimidating dimensions of Richard's old desk. Instead, it invites brilliant minds to share innovative ideas without fear of tyrannical retribution. Every executive seated around this magnificent structure understands the immense, agonizing sacrifice required to secure this room. I did not simply inherit this beautiful piece of furniture through an accident of birth, nor did I steal it through illegal financial manipulation. I built this dominant, unshakable empire directly from the smoldering, toxic ashes of their monumental betrayal. I claimed my rightful territory, utilizing nothing but absolute truth and superior intelligence. As I formally call the important meeting to order, my secure digital tablet vibrates briefly against the solid wood. The screen illuminates, displaying a highly confidential encrypted message from Maya. She has identified a massive structural vulnerability concerning Marcus Thorne's primary European distribution hubs. A slow, genuinely predatory smile graces my features as I look out over the sprawling city skyline below. The domestic table is finally mine, fully secured and completely operational. However, the international market is vast, and there is always another vulnerable empire desperately waiting to be conquered by a superior mind. When the towering glass doors of a maritime empire shatter, the jagged pieces reflect far more than a simple corporate bankruptcy. They mirror the profound, devastating collapse of a home. We watched the Sterling dynasty crumble into the dust of municipal auctions and minimum wage humiliations. But the true implosion began decades earlier. It did not start in a mahogany boardroom or a federal courthouse. It began in the quiet, formative corners of a sprawling suburban estate, rooted in a catastrophic failure of parenting. The ultimate demise of Richard and Patricia was never merely about lost shipping routes or frozen offshore trusts. It was the inevitable harvest of the seeds they planted in their children. In American culture, the traditional family structure is often idealized as a sanctuary of unwavering support and moral instruction. We are taught that parents are the primary architects of a child's ethical foundation, responsible for instilling the enduring virtues of honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness. Yet the Sterling family represents a terrifying deviation from this ideal. They weaponized their vast wealth, using it not as a tool for opportunity, but as a heavy velvet curtain to conceal their moral bankruptcy. In doing so, they created a generational tragedy that serves as a chilling cautionary tale for anyone sitting at the head of a family table today. Consider the tragic trajectory of Derek, the pampered heir apparent. His spectacular downfall into a heavily garnished, low-level retail management position was not a sudden unlucky twist of fate. It was the inevitable culmination of a lifetime of toxic entitlement. Richard and Patricia believed that unconditional love meant unconditional protection from consequences. Whenever their son stumbled, failed, or cheated, they did not guide him toward accountability. Instead, they hastily paved over his transgressions with cash and convenient excuses. They robbed him of the essential human experience of earning his own redemption, effectively stunting his emotional growth. When you raise a child without enforcing the sacred boundary of fairness, you do not create a strong leader. You cultivate a vulnerable parasite. Derek's decision to secretly short-sell his own father's company and criminally forge his wife's signature for a home equity loan was not an anomaly. It was the logical extension of a childhood where the rules never applied to him. By shielding him from the minor scraped knees of youth and the natural penalties of early mistakes, his parents inadvertently set him up for a fatal moral execution in adulthood. True family responsibility requires the terrifying courage to let your children fail. It requires allowing them to feel the stinging burn of their own misjudgments so they might eventually learn how to stand back up with genuine, tested integrity. Conversely, we must examine the brutal marginalization of Bernice. Within the exact same walls that sheltered Derek's boundless arrogance, Bernice was subjected to a chilling lack of emotional awareness and fundamental respect. She was continually dismissed, underestimated, and treated as a secondary citizen within her own bloodline. The glaring inequality in how the parents distributed their affection and validation became the very forge that tempered Bernice's indestructible resolve. When parents exhibit blatant favoritism, they do not merely alienate the neglected child. They plant a slow-burning fuse of resentment that will eventually detonate the entire family structure. Fairness in parenting is not merely about ensuring every child receives the exact same monetary inheritance. It is about the equitable distribution of dignity. Richard and Patricia completely failed to recognize the quiet brilliance sitting right beside them, blinded by their obsession with a patriarchal legacy that Derek was entirely unqualified to carry. By the time Richard was reduced to wearing a cheap synthetic polo shirt, greeting warehouse workers for minimum wage at the company his stepdaughter now owned, the poetic justice was absolute and undeniable. The child they starved of validation became the singular force capable of dismantling their toxic kingdom. Had they nurtured Bernice with the same emotional generosity they squandered on Derek, the empire might have stood for a century. Instead, they handed her the very hammer she used to smash their throne into splinters. This narrative forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about legacy and family responsibility. In our relentless pursuit of the American dream, it is dangerously easy to confuse financial provision with actual parenting. We spend our most energetic years building fortresses of wealth, acquiring tangible assets and securing offshore trusts, mistakenly believing that money will insulate our offspring from the harsh realities of the world. But money without morality is a loaded weapon placed in the hands of an infant. The Sterling family possessed millions, but because they lacked a compass of rigorous honesty, their massive fortune became the mechanism of their own violent destruction. Long-term guidance for children must be anchored in the unshakable bedrock of truth. It means having the difficult, agonizing conversations when a child strays from the correct path. It means demanding absolute accountability, even when it breaks your heart to see them struggle under the weight of their own actions. Maya, stepping into the corporate boardroom as the harbinger of absolute truth, represented the ultimate manifestation of these ignored values. Her powerful presence was a stark reminder that the universe will eventually demand a strict accounting. If a family does not internally regulate its own morality, the outside world will enthusiastically do it for them, and the world's justice is infinitely less forgiving than a parent's discipline. As Patricia now sits in a damp, cramped apartment meticulously clipping grocery coupons, and as Richard humiliatingly holds the heavy glass doors for the woman he once called a mere waitress, we are left to ponder the monumental gravity of our own domestic choices. They are living ghosts, haunted every single day by the realization that their ruin was entirely preventable. They built a sprawling house on a fragile foundation of lies, deceit, and favoritism. And when the fierce storms of truth finally arrived, the structure could not hold. The lessons woven through this dark tapestry are vital for anyone striving to raise strong, capable humans in today's complex society. We must deliberately prioritize character over comfort. We must teach our children that true, lasting power is derived from competence, resilience, and honesty, not from the manipulation of shadows or the exploitation of others. If we genuinely want our families to endure the test of time, we must lead them with a fierce, unwavering commitment to fairness and profound emotional intelligence. If you found yourself captivated by the sharp twists, the profound betrayals, and the deeply satisfying justice of this saga, there are countless more narratives waiting for you to discover. Stories that boldly explore the darkest corners of human nature, alongside the brightest triumphs of the resilient spirit. Please follow the channel, Linda Vengeance, for more thrilling, emotionally charged tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat while making you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty, wealth, and power. Ultimately, as we step away from the polished oak of Bernice's new boardroom, the silence leaves us with a lingering, profound question. We look around our own living rooms, staring at the faces gathered around our own dinner tables, and we must honestly ask ourselves what we are truly building. Are we meticulously constructing a resilient legacy grounded in honesty and mutual respect? Or are we quietly ignoring the small, expanding fractures that will one day bring the roof crashing down upon our heads? The table is perfectly set. The final choice of what to serve is entirely yours.